Alright, hello everybody. This is AW, aka Antonio Wolf, aka whatever Lefty Pole calls me. According to a fictitious Jason Unruhe.
Unruhe.
Oh, it's Unruhe?
Well,
Isn't that like not even his last name?
I don't know, but
Supposedly it's not his last name.
yeah, Unruhe means restlessness in German.
But whatever. Joshua and Hyperion with me here today. Joshua recommended an essay called With or Without You, Beyond the Postcolonial Hegel by Fayaz Chagani from York University. This was presented at Philosophy in the West, a great graduate philosophy conference from the New School for Social Research back in March 2nd, 2013. And it is, of course, about postcolonial theory and Hegel. One of those things I know fuck all about, but we're still going to read it anyways. It's pretty short. We'll see if we learn something. You know? At best, at worst, we go, wow, this is stupid. At best, we learn something. So, With or Without You, Beyond the Postcolonial Hegel, Fayaz Chagani, York University. To say that postcolonialism has a vexed relationship with Hegel is to understate the matter. On the one hand, the distinctively Hegelian oppositions of self and other, identity and difference, universal and particular, have structured debates in the field from its very inception. Without them, postcolonial thinkers would not discuss, let alone critique, the various modes of domination at work in the confrontation between colonizer and colonized, West and non-West. On the other hand, theorists from Edward Said to Dipesh Chakrabarti have been unyielding in their efforts to escape Hegel, his categories, his dialectical method, his philosophy of history. Until recently, this involved an all but complete rejection of Marxism as well, according to many in the field. Marxist and neo-Marxist theory was irreparably tainted by its Hegelian roots. Footnote, Robert Young sums up the sentiment well. Quote, Marxism, insofar as it inherits the system of the Hegelian dialectic, is also implicated in the link between the structures of knowledge and the forms of oppression of the last 200 years, a phenomenon that has become known as Eurocentrism. End quote. See White Mythologies, Writing History in the West. This paper examines this anxiety of influence. As an alternative to the knee-jerk dismissal of all things vaguely Hegelian, it makes the argument that certain Hegelian ideas continue to hold promise for a post-colonial project. To this end, I want, first of all, to identify the, quote, post-colonial Hegel, unquote, that is, the version of him that thinkers in the field have found so troubling. Next, I will point out that some of the problems with this rendering for robust post-colonial... Next, I will point out some of the problems with this rendering for a robust postcolonial politics. In the final part of the essay, I will look at Professor Buck Moore's Hegel, Haiti, and Universal History to see how she, quote, decolonizes, unquote, Hegel, as well as to find ways we can sort out Hegel's useful from his problematic bits. The post-colonial Hegel. The post-colonial Hegel is a rather idiosyncratic one. The concern of so much post-colonial scholarship is not to escape Hegel per se, but Hegelianism, or, to be more specific, the Hegel who has been, ironically, foundational for post-structuralist thought. This Hegel, as a number of accounts have shown, is the one advanced by Alexandre Kojève in his influential lectures on the phenomenology of spirit. Kojève's reading presents the master-slave dialectic as the key to Hegel's thinking and, especially, to his understanding of the mechanics of historical progression. It also puts the accent on the excessive, violent, and totalitarian aspects of his philosophy. Inasmuch as it has been informed by French post-structuralism, and this seems undeniable, postcolonial theory has inherited the same Hegel. At the same time, postcolonial authors have been predictably more concerned than their theoretical forebears with Hegel's Eurocentrism. Whatever the problems with the postcolonial appropriation of Hegel, there is no denying this fact. Hegel was self-consciously Eurocentric and in a way that outmatched his contemporaries. This is nowhere clearer than in his posthumously published Lectures on the Philosophy of History. Here, Hegel elaborates his now infamous thesis that world history travels from east to west, for in his words, Europe is the absolute end of history, just as Asia is the beginning. But if Asia, or at least China, India, and Persia, are generously awarded a world historical role, only the latter can be considered truly historical. China and India, according to Hegel, remain stationary and perpetuate a natural vegetative existence even to the present time. As for Africa, the Americas, and other parts of Asia, they are obviously unhistorical and scarcely worth discussing. In light of this assessment, it is not difficult to see that Marx's own assessment of Indian society, that it has no history at all, has a remarkably Hegelian inflection. But if Marx's views on non-Western societies becomes more generous over time, Hegel's did not. Despite his greater attention to African studies in the 1820s, there is reason to believe in Professor Buckmore's words that, quote, Hegel was in fact becoming dumber, end quote. It happens to everybody, I think, at some point Grandpa just doesn't learn new things. I mean, just to say something, like, frankly, I don't really care about this issue, like, to be honest, like, because I have no care really about Hegel's own personal views and ideas. Because insofar they were personal, well, and just, merely contingently historical, it's interesting, but I just have no personal interest in that.
It just informs his philosophy. Not particularly, I don't think.
Yeah, no,
I mean, I don't think it's essential to his philosophy that China is considered stationary.
I mean, there's like there are things to say about that which have to do with like the whole idea of that universal history. And I have to read Kant's essay on that. He has an essay on the very concept of a universal history. And just to say something about the philosophy of history, the whole issue of that is like, what is the historical development of the lived concepts of history? Where do they originate? Where do they go? Where does development happen?
Yeah.
And in one of those ways, the way he portrays it is partly right, partly wrong. And it's wrong in that, he takes an incomplete historical narrative. God knows we have plenty of holes in history that are just gone. I mean, that doesn't go into the fact that Hyperion and I have certain ideas about history which just go even beyond what most of you people would accept.
Yeah.
So, he's wrong definitely in that sense. Nonetheless, he's wrong in that way. But in other ways, I mean, the idea of the universal history was like, well, who's leading history here? And the question is, really, a broadly historical one. Yeah, world history specifically. Because that's really what he's interested in, world history. What effects have they had on world history?
Yeah.
And there's a difference between things beginning in a certain place and things ending in a certain place. And, Hegel frames this in an honestly, it's very clearly racist way. Not racist in a genetic way, but, he's a culturally racist guy.
It's not inherently racist. It's just the way he critiques it. I can see why people would think he was racist. Even though I don't really think he was necessarily in the way that, most racists are.
Yeah, no, he wasn't like modern racist.
Yeah, there was a great essay, not essay, but like 2 pages that one of our friends who no longer uses Twitter posted, so it's not there anymore. I wish I saved that because it was really good, but maybe we'll find it again.
But what was it about?
About Hegel's racism and how he wasn't necessarily racist. One posted it.
Was it the one about how people like keep harping on about Hegel's racism, and yet Hegel's like pretty much the one philosopher who took like the other people genuinely seriously?
Yeah.
I mean, people like harp on about, oh, he was a racist and he said this and that, and he's like, but have you noticed that no one else even they don't even consider them. You know, like, oh well, you know, those Asians.
It's just unfortunate that Egypt wasn't even known at the time, you know, as really that much of a great society or anything. We didn't know much about it. Most of our history of Egypt and so on.
Stuff was coming about. Yeah, most of it was coming about
at the time, though. So he probably didn't know that much about it, you know.
And
because Napoleon was the first one to really have an interest in Egypt in the West in recent time.
Yeah, and I think that also applies to his disregard for Africa in general. We were like less aware of all the big empires and kingdoms that were there, because I think like around this time the slave trade started ending and they started collapsing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a whole lot of historical interest.
The Inca.
Oh yeah, so there's just a general historical ignorance that pervaded the time, and I mean, you know, there was knowledge coming out, and Hegel seemed to have ignored it. So you know, no excusing that. But at the same time, it's like what I was saying about the whole idea of the universal history before, about like, you know, where do ideas come from and who is pushing the world forward. You can complain all you want. It is very obvious who has led the world forward for the last 300, 400 years. Not forward, and I'm not talking about forward in like the good sense or in the progressive sense, but you know, who is shaping world history? It's the fucking West. It's Europe.
The Europeans, yeah.
So you know, when Hegel was saying, you know, like history, you know, has come to an end in Europe, he's right. It's still in Europe, except China. You know, China is increasingly coming to the world stage, and you know, a lot of people have been saying that. You know, people in the West and everywhere. You know, China's coming. China is going to have its day to shine in world history.
I don't doubt it at all.
And so, you know, what does that tell you? We began with China, and it's about to come back to China. And that's exactly the kind of coincidences you expect with, you know, Hegel's dialectic of history. You know, so, you know, has Africa had like a major role in leading the world in, you know, the last, say, 1,000 years? Not overtly, really. Not as far as we know yet. You know, maybe there's plenty of things where people say like, you know, this originates here, this originates like that, and we can start piecing it together. But you know, the fact is, Europe has indeed been pretty much dominating the trends of the world for the last couple hundred years, and that's just the fact.
India's on the rise too.
Yeah, India's on the rise as well. You know, they're becoming they're definitely gaining in economic power as well as plenty of other things. And you know, they have different ideas.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Yeah, so you know, there's a difference between like, you know, that idea of universal history in which like you can excuse some of what Hegel says, and there's the other difference between which, you know, you sort of centralize this and say, oh, it's because of the Africans are just like, you know, these dumb, stupid people, and you know, their children, you know, spiritually, you know, that's just the character they have. Even then, by the way, I mean, like, Hegel wasn't a racist, like, you know, people's like, oh, the Africans have lower IQs, you know, therefore, yeah, they're just subhumans. No, Hegel didn't believe that, you know, he thought that there was a way to transcend it. You know, it just happens to...
That was Kant.
Yeah, Kant was pretty racist in that sense.
Yeah,
yeah, but, so my question is world history even a viable concept until a few hundred years ago? Because, like, for the longest time, the world's been pretty isolated with itself, especially like the Americas.
Oh no! Here I'll say, like, absolutely, there has been a world history for thousands of years. You know, we don't have many records still, but we know for a fact there has been a long line of thought going through basically the old world. We know less about the new world, but even in the new world, we know that there are lines of developing thought. You know, there was definitely culture here, and so, you know, when you know this, they mention, you know, it's like Hegel obviously doesn't even mention the Americas, that's kind of weird. Well, he doesn't mention the Native Americans. He kind of thinks of them just kind of like he thinks the Africans. They were these people who were just kind of stunted. They were the Europeans come and they mow them down. Well, what purpose do they have in world history? For us, let's face it. Let's be honest. Almost none. Most of us are ignorant of anything that the Native Americans had to add to our culture. Despite the fact, by the way, the idea of the federal was it not confederacy? It's like, well, the federal system, by the way, what was the Cherokees had it, right? We got the idea from them, the founding fathers. At least that's what I've heard of that.
Apache, maybe? I don't know. Sorry, it was one of them. Yeah. Because
they had a constitution. They had a constitution. They also had the federal system set up. So So I don't know much details on this, but I've definitely heard it a couple times in my life that we got that idea from them. So there's something.
The Incas, they had communism.
Yeah.
Like they had a centrally planned economy.
Yeah, but we didn't get that idea from them. That's like, and that's kind of like Hegel's point. We didn't get these ideas from them, so they're irrelevant. And as far as it goes, the fact that multiple people have certain ideas everywhere around it, if you're going to go by the world historical narrative of like how things have actually happened, there are people who are going to be left out, despite the fact that they might have had these ideas, but maybe we didn't get from them, so it's kind of irrelevant. But I think like much of the issue just lies in whether we think those people really had nothing at all, because there's a difference between recognizing that they obviously had something, and the other difference, which is did we take it from them? The Incas had zeros.
It was the Iroquois.
What? Thank you.
It was the Iroquois Confederacy. Yeah.
Yeah. See, so they do have a role, but at the same time, how much of a role? And let's face it, it's not much. That's still not to say that Western supremacy is the end of history, because I'm of the opinion that these people still have a lot to teach us spiritually in many ways, as well as just socially. And so a further movement towards the future is a integration of these kinds of different views, which aren't necessary. It's like I don't want to go back to like the ways of life of the Native Americans. Should we live a simple life and whatnot? That's nice for you if you're a hippie, but that's not my kind of idea of where I want to go.
Yeah.
But you definitely need. I definitely think there's plenty of value in having these other aspects of their culture, which are just universally important. As well as just finding out the history, finding out that these people weren't just fucking morons. They weren't simpletons. They had very advanced concepts, very advanced cultures. And so I think there is definitely value to be looking at. Did they have philosophies? If they did, what was it like? What did they have? Unfortunately, the fucking Spaniards ruined most of it because they burnt most of the stuff that they had. They had books. They had stuff written down, but we destroyed most of it. So there's that gone out of the way. Much of the holes in history are basically because of these morons that came and said well, we're just gonna burn all these books because fuck knowledge. God.
Caesar had an accident. Yeah.
But anyways, okay, let's continue. Just that was
okay.
Secant, I suppose. Continuing, but if Marx's views on non-Western societies became more generous over time, Hegel's did not. Despite his great attention to African studies in the 1820s, there is reason to believe, as Professor Buckmore's words, that, quote, Hegel was in fact becoming dumber, end quote. But where does this leave the earlier and more influential phenomenology of spirit? Even here, it seems Hegel's reputation as a bigot is well deserved. Take, for example, the section on religion. In it, Hegel describes a historical sequence in which various primitive and oriental forms serve as nothing but pale reflections of the Christian one. The hopes and expectations, quote, the hopes and expectations of the world up till now had pressed forward solely to this revelation, end quote, he proclaims. That is the revelation of Christianity. The case of the famous master-slave relation is more complex, but still unsettling, especially when read through the lens of Kojève. For a post-colonial sensibility, there's certainly promise in the idea that it is the slave, not the master, who is the motor of historical progress. More disconcerting, however, is the implication that human beings are always necessarily and essentially either master or slave, or that one can achieve his true autonomy, his authentic freedom, only after passing through slavery. One would be forgiven for being confused. Hegel's accounts, the master-slave relation, appears to justify imperialism and colonialism at the same time as it sides with the colonized. That contradiction is typical Hegel.
Mm-hmm.
Although on the thing on Christianity, by the way, I mean, like,
yeah, I was gonna
say, you can disagree with me, and if you have anything to say in the comments, actually, please do. If you have anything to link to me, I'd like just going against this. I'd like to read it. I'm in agreement with Hegel for a large part, but it's not just because of Christianity. There's a. If you look at Eastern, philosophies at the time, and I'll tell you right now, I am highly ignorant of India, so I'm partly talking out of my ass here, but I'm not completely ignorant. So I was interested in the philosophy for a while, and they don't have no idea of rights, buddies. The idea of duties is there. The idea of know your place, know your rank is there, but we did not get the idea of rights from the Indians. These ideas of rights come from Europe. They're not purely the product of Europe, but there's a long history in which, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, play into this whole idea that comes together as rights. This universalization of the idea of the freedom of the individual, the idea, that you're not just tied to this destiny, that, there's the existential issues. Those open up because of, this Western Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. And that's pretty damn unique. Because, yes, there are things like rights in other portions of historical societies, but they're not qualified with right as right in the sense that we get in Europe. And I think there's a lot of value within the concept of right that we get in Europe, which is you just don't find anywhere else. And that is definitely tied to the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. That whole line, it's not just purely Christianity, but, because the big three, play a part. You don't get much.
Abrahamic religions.
Yeah, it's the Abrahamic religions in general. There was something rather unique to them, which is not quite found in anything else, because you do have. I mean, the idea of the monotheistic God, not unique. The idea, that God loves you, and there's like or that but there's a heaven and there's a hell, not unique. All these other things, but some things just come out uniquely there. This idea of the individuals, these ideas of rights, and blah blah blah. One definitely finds a history that has to trail back all the way back to India, Asia, and China, and wherever else before that. Things may come. But that development happens with that tradition that goes into Western Europe, and through the Middle East as well.
And is that to say that there's nothing unique or interesting or worthy to be kept from the other ones? No, of course not.
Well, no,
I know people might say that.
Yeah,
like,
no.
Christianity's better in every way. No.
No, actually, I don't think Hegel plays it up as this is some sort of unique thing. Ultimately, once we figure out the philosophical value of it, nobody cares. Also,
go ahead. Sorry. Oh, I was just gonna say, and as an aside, of course he had to say this, because if he didn't, he would have been expelled from academia. That as well.
Yeah, he wasn't above bootlicking for his own benefit. So so this is one of the. Yeah, go ahead.
Would have ended up like fish to.
Yeah.
Oh God.
And he kept a copy of the Bhagavad-Gita at his bedside.
Yeah, I mean, there's a book that came out recently, Hegel's India, in which, one of the interesting things they note, I didn't know that, obviously, before. I read at least an excerpt review on it, which is that Hegel wrote as much about India as he wrote about, in total, everyone else. Why was that? Because, he himself had to admit that there was something genuinely speculative and advanced in Indian philosophy. And why wouldn't there be? At least it was. I don't know yet. a lot of people collapse, like for example, Winfield himself says, we only know two great philosophical traditions that have ever arisen in the history of the world, and that is India and Europe. And he thinks that China is just an extension of the Indian tradition, in which it seems to me that's quite true. I don't know if that's fully true that we can just reduce China to India. I don't think that's necessarily true.
Yeah.
We find at least nowadays I'm hearing more about things like Mohism, and we know there's been far more than just Confucianism and Taoism. There's been far more happening in China than we knew a century ago. So so there's that. But yeah, he was interested in all these things, and he definitely as well, which is why I say I don't really care about his own personal dimensions. Like he had problems with accepting that that it might be the case that indeed the Indians had far more advanced philosophies than he was willing to admit, and I think they did. Like for example, my personal opinion, and that is honestly relatively ignorant, not completely, but I'll admit I'm relatively ignorant of it, is that at least the Indian philosophy on its own got to the gate of Kant. You can learn pretty much anything that's within the Western tradition, also in the Eastern tradition, all the way up to people like Kant. And if they didn't get to Kant as well, they didn't have the interest that Kant has. Kant gets to Kant to be Kant. Why? Because there's a split between the scientific realist tradition, tradition that's coming up in Europe. There's this obsession with trying to unite science and the spiritual, and trying to cash out these problems of knowledge, and how does Kant solve them? Well, he does what he does. Focuses on epistemology as such, focuses on the structure of the mind, and why would the Eastern Indians and Chinese really care about that if they don't have that tradition going on? They don't have the same ideas impacting. So of course you would expect that there would be a split there, and after that, things no longer remain pure. There's no longer a pure Indian philosophy, for example. There's no longer a pure Chinese philosophy, for example. And likewise, at the turn of the colonial world, it was no longer the case that there was even a pure European tradition, because for example, the German idealists and the people around those times, post Descartes, you get Leibniz, all these people were reading, they were excited about finding out, what does China know? These people came, missionaries went to China, went to India, they translated the texts, they brought them back, and people were like, holy shit, here are some new ideas, and they were going through them, and some ideas were indeed new, some of them were exciting, and they integrated them. They as the time was back then, they never said like, oh, we got this from the Indians. They just take it and hey, we can use it.
But that's cultural appropriation, W.
Yeah. So so there's the unhidden acknowledgement, the hidden unacknowledgement of what we took from these other traditions. And nowadays they're definitely interested in what the West says, and the West is still for the most part uninterested in what they say. Every time I look up stuff, especially on Hegel and Marx, and pretty much anybody really, and you'll find articles and books, entire philosophy books, like from people from India, doing what? Responding to these Western ideas and reintegrating them, integrating them back into their own ideas. We don't do that in anywhere as close. They know all about our philosophies. We know fuck all about theirs.
Yeah, it's like there's something called the pizza effect, where it's named after how Italian immigrants came to the U.S. They made pizza popular here. It retroactively became popular in Italy. The same happened with like the Bhagavad-Gita. It was not that highly regarded. It was highly regarded, but it wasn't seen as like the canonical Hindu Bible. But now when people are introducing other people to Hinduism, they use it because the Westerners found the Bhagavad-Gita to be the most interesting of their texts.
Yeah. This is interesting. Doesn't Zizek goes on about that, right? About how he says like the Indians, like at least the more like the more nationalist ones, like the ones that are very social justice warrior, Itpol, whatever. they get inflamed about having to like know about these Western people, and they want them to we have our own cultural heritage, we want to focus on that, and the reason they have any obsession with their cultural heritage is because of Britain. Britain brought back Hindu. Hinduism was dying when Britain got to India. It was the British who became obsessed and fascinated by these things and revived it. And then the Indian says, "Oh, it's our cultural heritage," but it literally was reflected off of the British because the British found it of interest and found it important. Nobody cared, really, hardly anybody cared about the Bhagavad-Gita and the Vedas and whatnot. In India, the whole caste system had broken down, was breaking down, and it was actually partly revitalized mainly because of British interest in all these things and the reviving of these cultures. I mean, and it just kind of shows, most of us don't care about our own cultural heritage because we live it. It's of no importance. Yeah, until someone else brings it to our attention, and then, it's like, oh, then we have pride in it. Otherwise it just seems like, eh.
Yeah, I think that's another important thing that should be mentioned. Racism isn't really the only form of cultural colonialism. Orientalism is another large part of it.
Yeah, there's no supremacy. There's people who are like, well, you got to read these Indian philosophers. You got to read these Chinese philosophers. We have a pretty broad base with, the so-called quote-unquote Western canon. And the Western canon is really whatever you want to make it. There are the major figures and then there are the minor figures. And, you can make a minor figure, a major figure, however you like. Sometimes you don't really care about what Plato himself says. You're more interested in Plotinus. You think Plotinus brings out Plato more than Plato. And you can do that. And and there are people who definitely focus on these minor figures and whatnot. And there's an immense wealth of details. I mean, even in the West, we don't know what the West itself has generally thought. Because there's a lot of people in between, and you can focus your entire life on just any of these little people, and they turn out to be not so little. They turn out to be actually, when you look at it, pretty damn influential. But they weren't the big names, and this is what happens, with pretty much everything else. It turns out, they were influential, and yet they weren't the ones that we remembered. Yeah. And does it matter? Do we have to go and read, Adi Shankara? Stuff about Advaita Vedanta. No, I mean, I think you could read Spinoza and pretty much get most of it the same. You might be interested in the ideas of dharma and karma and all these other things. But then again, you might not. For example, I'm certainly not. I just don't find those concepts interesting. Some people think that's a better way to look at the world. Oh, maybe, but I don't feel that way. And the way I understand those concepts, I don't care. But you can focus on here, you can focus there, and ideas are ideas. Whether they're from India or whether they're from here, they are what they are. And I don't quite care where they come from.
Sources are all.
I do think I do think it's important to sort of but to genuinely recognize that other people aren't morons and idiots, and that they weren't there waiting for us to come and enlighten them. A lot of them were pretty damn enlightened already. And and if you want to learn from them, there is definitely things to learn from them. And there are things that you should learn from them, but you also don't have to necessarily learn it from them. We have our own little minor figures within our cultures, within our tradition, in which you can look to and just get about the same. For example, you don't have to go to the Buddhists to get much of what the Buddhists say. You can go to the Stoics. You don't have to go to Advaita Vedanta. You can go to Spinoza. You can go to Plotinus. You can go to so many other people. You don't have to go in. Most of these ideas are just intermixed and intertwined by nowadays. It doesn't really matter where you are. If someone from India comes and says, I think you're wrong, doesn't mean you dismiss them. As a matter of fact, you go and say, well, okay, fine, let's discuss. But yeah, I don't even know where we started with that. We just kind of went on that tangent.
Yeah, that was a tangent. But I think it makes sense. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I think it's relevant to the topic.
Oh yeah, we started about the whole thing about Christianity. How it
Yeah.
Christianity definitely did have something unique to offer, and I stand by that. I'm not a Christian, but there are just things about it which are uniquely speculative. They're not perfectly unique to the West. By example, once you start looking at other places, you find, these ideas could have arisen in other places. For example, the Bhagavad-Gita is one of those places in which you can get the idea of the tripartite idea of God. For example, I think Hegel plays it up too much that the Trinity is a speculative truth of religion. I think there's something there. It happens to have that structure, but I don't think anybody actually until Hegel had any clue that had any real meaning, because nobody understood it. It was a mystery. It's the mystery of the Trinity. Hegel then gets this idea of the concept, the universal, particular, individual, and says, aha, that's what makes sense of the Trinity. Yeah, sure, you can do that, but did it necessarily have anything to do with that? I don't think so. You could probably have, there are other places where you find something similar, not as irrational as the Trinity seemed, but you get these triads, and you could go and say, aha, there it is. And so there's no inferiority ultimately. It's not like Christianity is superior to Hinduism or any other religion. It's whatever way you look at it. So Hegel racist, yeah, but frankly, I just don't care. More problematic still, continuing the next paragraph, is the enormous influence Hegel's work has had on the forms of knowledge production that followed him, not least in the field of postcolonial studies itself. In other words, Hegel's Eurocentrism is not just a matter of historical curiosity, it is a fundamental feature of contemporary knowledges. The Hegelian dialectic, his systematizing solution to the problems of Western philosophy, has become the dominant paradigm for thinking about the nature and dynamics of historical time and, in turn, the relationship between the West and the non-West. It has made it possible to organize the world into historic and unhistoric peoples, and insofar as it defines an other to be assimilated, Hegel's system has been the perfect accompaniment to, as well as impetus for, colonialism and imperialism. As Robert Young explains, Hegel articulates a philosophical structure of the appropriation of the other as a form of knowledge, which uncannily simulates the project of 19th century imperialism. The construction of knowledges, which all operate through forms of expropriation and incorporation of the other, mimics at a conceptual level the geographical and economic absorption of the non-European world by the West. Okay, I mean, I guess this is related. You'd have to read the section and some commentaries on it to fully get what I'm about to say. But this whole issue of the master-slave, by the way, it's not Hegel's positive account of what self-consciousness or consciousness or recognition actually is. It's just a historical form of recognition that came about, or an attempt at recognition, or an attempt at self-knowledge that came about as a form of life. That's just the fact. Yeah, we had slavery. Yeah, some people did see the world in which I am the self-conscious, you are the object. I am superior, I am self-conscious, I am free, you are inferior, you are you are literally the subject, you're subjected to me. And, you're just a tool. And when he describes the relationship of how it functions, and he says, well, who learns? Who is actually self-conscious in that relationship? It actually is the slave. Because the slave actually recognizes a real other, whereas, the master, if we take it in absolute form, cannot recognize an other, cannot actually have self-consciousness, cannot recognize an object in which they are reflected as the kind of being that they are. And so why does this mirror, what the colonialist project was? Because that's just what it is. There's nothing, spooky about this, Hegel's idea because of colonialism. He does and he does not. One, it's just, it happens. It doesn't have to even happen on, a general scale. It can happen on a personal scale. It can happen within you. There are multiple levels in which one can understand this whole process, and it works. And it's true. There's a way of knowing which comes out of domination of the other. And if you stick to that, you done goofed. Because that's not going to give you the satisfaction that you're seeking, ultimately. And, obviously, do the masters over slaves get a sort of satisfaction for that? Yes. But is it the ultimate, fulfilling satisfaction that we are seeking as spiritual human beings or whatever? Self-actualization, all these things? No, it's not. But that has nothing to do, really, with, some sort of, historical indictment that this is what should be happening. It isn't. Hegel's not saying this is what should be happening. It's just, it's what you would expect to happen if this was the logic that was going on.
Yeah. Well, I don't think he's saying that Hegel supports the master-slave balance, as a structure.
Well, I mean, he's mentioned, at least not the quote of the Robert Young, but he mentions the other stuff in which, people mistake this as, Hegel saying that this has to happen. Since it happened, it obviously had to happen.
Yeah.
What Zizek says, retroactive. Well, what is it? It's not causality, is it? Retroactive necessity.
Yeah, retroactive.
Since it happened, we know it had to happen. It didn't just happen out of fucking nowhere. If we do this and we have done this in a general form, this means that this is some sort of relationship we have to ourselves. That has to be played out. Is it the positive way that has to be played out? No. Hegel's not saying this is how it should have played out or should play out. I mean, clearly we've got, by the time you get to, colonial Europe, we've learned we haven't fully learned yet what being a human being is, what a self-consciousness fully is. But was there some sort of necessity that we just couldn't recognize the Africans for their own good, and the Africans couldn't recognize us, and so we had to enslave them in order for us to learn what it really was to be a human being? No, that's just stupid. We all know that the Europeans deluded themselves literally into making them the other. They knew exactly, they knew what they were doing at the beginning. Everybody knows what they were doing. Everybody knows that was a slave master knew that, the people they had weren't these inferior people who were just hopeless and hapless and stupid, and they actually needed the slave master to save them from themselves. They buy into they lie to themselves. What's that? Frederick Douglass, his autobiography, where he talks about how he begins with he was his slave master, his wife's slave, and at first she sees the humanity in him. Why? Because it's so obvious that if you're not fucked in the head, you see that these are human beings. And then, across time, eventually her husband says, what are you doing? They're a slave, they're stupid, you're ruining them. You're teaching them things and making them suffer. And then she became cruel, and then she bought into the lie. And then she became just another, like the slave master. She couldn't recognize his humanity. But you notice that she had to lie to herself and buy into that lie. It's not that this just naturally happens that we enslave each other. No. We lie to ourselves. One makes that situation. This situation in the master slave in which, we just can't recognize the other. It's bullshit. That never had any necessity of actually really happening. As such, that it had, the way Hegel even describes it is like, where does this cognitively make sense? Literally, when you refuse, one, you don't know, and you refuse to know that there is an other than yourself. And this is literally on a level of, even less than cavemen. It's like two completely asocial beings encounter each other, and they refuse to believe that, this sociality is real, that there really is another self-consciousness, and therefore, they play against each other in this fight to the death of, I'm the real deal and you're just an object. You can't be conscious. I'm self-conscious. I'm the absolute. And the whole struggle to the death is who is it? And if I am the absolute, I gotta be the all-powerful one. And how do I prove that? I gotta kill you. Either you submit to me or I gotta kill you. One way or the other, I'm the only one there. You can't be conscious. And, I'd rather die than recognize you. That's what happens. But that's literally on a level of just like, of a myth, that doesn't really happen. Well, I mean, like the whole misrecognition and unrecognition. Yeah. It does happen, by the way. But I'm not
it
like
definitely happens. It happens now a lot.
Yeah, but it doesn't happen in the way that people seem to think it happens. Nowadays it's not even comparable to what the struggle to the death is. Because that relationship with the master slave is completely primitive compared to what, by the time colonialism happens, like that's not what is happening at all.
Mm-hmm.
So continuing,
if you want a modern example, I guess you can think of like how Trump just calls other countries shitholes or whatever. It's the same type of thing, like American superiority or whatever.
Yeah, and people delude themselves,
Are they really shitholes beyond saving? Or
yeah, I mean,
not saving, but like
they're ignorant. They're even ignorant on purpose. They refuse to look at information that contradicts them. Why? They just don't want to believe it. They want to be deluded. If they were actually forced to really look at it, you bet your ass they couldn't hold that belief. If you actually had to really look at the Africans, you couldn't possibly hold the beliefs, of being a racist. If you actually looked at the facts of what happened to Africa, you can't be a moron who says, oh, it's because of their low IQs and their primitive peoples. All it takes is you actually have to be open and look. And the only time, this unrecognition, this lack of recognition happens is exactly when you refuse to accept what you see. So continuing, moreover, Young adds, any discourse which employs dialectics without due attention to its constitutive Eurocentrism is equally suspect. This includes Marxism, especially in its Hegelian Western incarnation, despite its obvious anti-imperialist credentials. A related concern with the Hegelian model is that it reduces politics and historical processes to a competition between two and only two opposing forces. In the case of Marxism, where the categories and world historical function, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat clearly resembles those of Hegel's master and slave, this has often meant the marginalization of groups who could not be incorporated into the working class. Marx's lumpen proletariat is one well-worn example. For Young, at least, the non-dualistic conditions of the postcolonial world are better served by a Foucauldian micropolitics than a Hegelian dialectics. Well, I can see, like he says, they take Hegel through Kojève, so you can see that critique of coming in. It makes sense. I don't think Hegel's method, because I won't speak for Hegel, again, and as I said, I actually don't care what Hegel thinks. There's plenty of things in which I disagree with Hegel in his thoughts, because they're outdated and they're wrong. Or, sometimes they're just plain illogical. He breaks his own methodology. But yeah, there's nothing, about quote-unquote dialectics. And by dialectics, always have to be reminded that there's a distinction between the contradiction as dialectics and dialectic as its developmental progress and towards a totality. And if you look at the developmental dialectic towards the totality of history, I think Hegel is not too far off, despite, the otherwise racist things he says, the otherwise wrong, empirically, historically wrong things he notes. I think he has the generally right picture, although it's an incomplete picture, and the end of that really is not yet the end of history. At least not as actualized history. The U.S. is no more. Europe was no more the end of history than the U.S. currently right now is the end of history, and certainly China will not be the end of history once it has its own step on the world stage.
Capitalism with Asian values, as Zizek says.
Yeah. As an obvious point is the end of history will historically never happen. it's the whole end of history thing has to do with a logical consideration of a form. And even then, we don't have anything to say about that, because that's assuming too much about the future. That's assuming that there will ever come a point in the future in which we really have done and known everything. And so long as something remains open, new determinations are open to come in. So the system remains open at the same time while being closed. It's a typically Hegelian contradiction there. But yeah, the reduction of things to a one overarching determination is obviously false. Hegel himself is well aware of that. Dialectics are couched in nested in dialectics and dialectics and dialectics, and that's why the system builds up. You might be dealing with the dialectics of religion. Well, guess what? In all of that is implicated everything before it. The dialectics of art, the dialectics of every mode of art, the dialectics of the state, the dialectics of nature, the dialectics of logic. It's all there, and you can analyze things through all these other things. So, the duality is itself not strictly dual, ultimately. And if you can multi-layer it, and definitely has to be that way. Continuing, as I have said, this preference for post-structuralist approaches over Hegelian-inspired ones is common among postcolonial critics. The claim is that the latter are driven by a systematics of Aufhebung or sublation involving the assumption of particularity under the sign of a false universal. To put it another way, postcolonial theorists see the operation of the dialectic a logic of sacrifice. In the developmental scheme Hegel outlines in the Phenomenology, for example, no move to a heightened stage or shape of consciousness can be achieved without the supersession of a previous stage. Along the way, each is despoiled of its contingency and ambiguity. It is put to service as a mere moment in a grand narrative. Yeah, I suppose if one was reading this specifically to Kojève, I can see the disagreement, but otherwise, read the Phenomenology. I don't see how one can disagree. He makes it clear that things aren't kept in the way that they begin. There's something true about each of these moments, but the way they're maintained is not the same as in the moment when they first appear.
Yeah, but I don't think the moments are as irrelevant. Not irrelevant, but it seems like he's at least the way I'm interpreting it is that he's discounting the moment, saying that they're just a mere moment in a grand narrative. And perhaps, yes, they are, but they are important moments. Each moment is important. Maybe that's just my reading of
well, no. They're saying Hegel is discarding the moment.
Oh, okay.
Because they're saying he's bringing it. Yeah, I don't think he does either. I think you read the Phenomenology, you read anything by Hegel. Big thing he always brings up, sublation. Things aren't we're not throwing things away. We're building on them.
Yeah.
So they're this is the totalitarian reading of Hegel, of course. In which they think that this sublation is evil bad because it brings things back into unity, a forced unity that is not actually there. They call it he says under the sign of a false universal.
It's supposed to be the realization of its potentiality, more than just mashing two things together to see what happens.
Yeah. So when you get the sublation of the master and slave in self-consciousness, where do we go from that? We get to the beginnings of the interior self-consciousness. That is the actual sublation of the master-slave relation. You internalize that relationship within yourself, and you do it to yourself. And
then you're self-aware.
Yeah, and that is your internal self-awareness. You have a master-slave relationship to yourself, and that's just absolutely true. That is the relationship the reason has to your very being. You always have this split. That's exactly how how you are self-conscious. You have this split between your intuitions, your emotions, your feelings, your body, and then your conceptual mental self. And then you have this further split between that and your rational conceptual self, in which you may feel these urges, and your rational self is saying you can't go with these urges. What is that other than the master-slave relationship? You rule over yourself as if you ruled over your own, you're a slave to your own reason. That's the split that Kant brings about. He says, we have to use the moral law as something above ourselves, yet put there by ourselves. We agree to make it our own master, but we chose that master, And we treat it as a master, and sometimes we don't like it and it feels bad, but that's what it dictates, and that's what we do. We do that all the time. At least, unless the only time you don't do that is unless you're one of those people who's just like impulsive and does whatever they feel like at any moment. And if you're one of those people, got problems. So, but that's not what they're talking about. They're reading it another way. And that's not what this author is talking about. He's saying that's what the postcolonialists read it as. So, I was rereading that last sentence. Along the way, each is despoiled of its contingency and ambiguity. It is put to service as a mere moment in a grand narrative. So, there seems to be that they think the moment is far more important than Hegel gives it credit for. Continuing, there are perhaps no more unrelenting critics of this process in the field than Homi Bhabha and Dipesh Chakrabarti. Their work aims to find above all a way of addressing historical and cultural questions that is more open to otherness or difference. Bhabha, for his part, has proposed a number of influential formulations: mimicry, ambivalence, hybridity, all of which aim to disturb both the dialectical procedure and the stability of the binary divisions upon which it relies. The point is not to achieve a non-dialectical form of thought, although he does sometimes suggest this. Rather, it is to produce a non-Hegelian dialectic, one which negotiates or works through contradictions instead of transcending them. Don't know what Hegel they read, but the one I read definitely works through contradictions. Chakrabarti is similarly interested in avoiding what he sees as the typically Hegelian technique of subjecting the different life worlds and subaltern pasts to the mediation of a homogenizing middle term. In his view, dialectical thinking pays no attention to the problem in politics of translation, to the fact that the transposition of different historical and cultural moments involves a certain scandal or epistemic violence. A barter, or one-for-one model, promises a more sensitive approach, in his view. Through it, a relation between distinct life worlds can be achieved without the interference of a universal. The emphasis is shifted from assimilating heterogeneous cultural practices and worldviews to encounter and dialogue with them. It seems clear, then, that for the postcolonial Hegel, a middle term is necessary to mediate between the two extremes of Hegelian contradiction. This middle term is the imperializing force which both identifies oppositions and gathers them back into itself in the form of a spiritual unity. It is this Hegel which postcolonial thinkers are at pains to escape, and to whom they ask the characteristically postcolonial question: why must the universal mediate between the particulars? Well, I'll answer that question: because otherwise you couldn't come into any unity whatsoever, whether contingent or necessary. The fact that you have this dialogue, this encounter, is through a universal. That is what the universal is. This unity, that's how it's happening. What is the universal in all of this? It has to be reason, it has to be something. Because you can't have these disparate things that don't have anything to do with each other and are so different accordingly, therefore they have no universal unity, and then they come into contact. Well, how are you going to do that? You got to do it through universal. Something's got to be the universal. Because without the universal, you can't even have opposition. Because oppositions are opposites. They're on opposing sides. But to have opposing sides, you got to have something in which they are opposed. Speaking of which, when it comes to just the historical reality of this, economics has been the major drive of people coming together more than anything else. This was the case in the old world. Most people, went out in search of, finding out what is over the mountains. Yeah, what is over the mountains? And they find out, like, oh, there's a whole bunch of other people over there. Like, well, what do they have? They have stuff we don't have. And,
Where's your gold? Oh, you don't have any? We're just going to slaughter you.
Yeah, that too.
Happy Columbus Day.
Yeah. So, and then that's usually one of the ways in which this cultural mix happens. And it's obviously historically not ever been, not always been, it's mostly not been a barter situation in which, you have something we want, and, we have something you want, and so we're going to exchange. We're going to have, this equal exchange. And along with that, we're going to have this exchange of ideas. We're going to have this dialogue. And most of the time it's been, you have something we have, but we also have a bigger army, so we're just going to take it from you. And the exchange of ideas just happens to happen with the people who are curious about those ideas. And, yeah. So, this critique, I think, is irrelevant. I mean, does it seem relevant to you, like, historically? Because it seems irrelevant to me. I mean, it's not like Hegel or any other philosopher is actually, like, responsible for the fact that, people are selfish, and the people who have been in power are power-hungry as hell. And they just don't, and they don't care about your ideas, and they don't care about your humanity. And they're like, you have stuff I want. If we can just take it from you, we'll just take it from you. And that's what they do.
Yeah.
It's not something about reason or anything. It's not really a philosophical anything. It's just the way it's happened. The rape of India, the rape of the world has been through capitalism. Why? Because people are greedy and they want profit. And if they can get away with it by just murdering you, they will. And they have. And God knows if they will ever be brought into account. I hope they are, but so far, almost nobody has. Despite the fact that it's in our history books, everybody knows it, and nobody cares. Well, no,
our global economy is depleting the world of our lives and natural resources.
Yeah. So the issue of India becoming colonized has nothing to do with like, we hate the Indians for being Indians. The Western powers thought, fuck the Indians, we'll take what they have.
Yeah. We have a better culture.
Yeah, they're like, we have there's the assumption that they are automatically superior, so they don't care about their ideas. 2, they were technologically superior, and militarily superior, so they didn't give a fuck about their people. And the only reason they, the Indians remain as Indians because like the British found a use for them. And they're like, well, we're not going to bring all these British people to work this land. We have these Indians, they're all dirty, they're stupid, and, we'll just basically use them as like cheap labor. We'll hardly pay them, and we'll plunder this entire country. And that's exactly what they did. And that's exactly what India is doing to itself at the moment. More billionaires are coming out of India every year than in the last decade than ever before. What are they doing? They're plundering their own people. They don't give a fuck. They don't have any national pride about being Indian. They don't care. If they could make it that India was, just it's corrupt as fuck, as anywhere else. They have a better constitution than we have, and yet the constitution seems powerless because the people who have the power, the people with money, don't care. And the politicians are bought off and all these things, and what are we to do? What are we to say about this? It is indeed post-colonial, and basically they're colonizing themselves. What do you do about that? How's that any better than the British? I suppose there's some sort of psychological benefit, and it's like, well, at least it's not a foreigner like fucking me. It's my neighbor from down the road. At least he's the same color as me. Which, by the way, India is still a pretty damn racist country. If they still hold that the northern whiter people still look down on the southern darker people as inferior in.
And Pakistani and so on.
Yeah, it's like they're no better.
Oh, and then there's still the caste system, the untouchables.
Yeah, the fact that still hasn't been gotten rid of is just so much for the enlightened spiritual East.
Yeah, I don't even think we're post-colonial now.
Well, we're not, because there's still
It's just like Dylan Morin says, the American version is more insidious. The empires run on a different basis. we just go somewhere and install a Starbucks, and then they become capitalists.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's like literally like it's a spectacle. The spectacle draws people in, and if it doesn't draw them in, we'll bomb the hell out of you.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and like that's sort of the thing. Like, Britain doesn't actually own anything in Africa anymore, nor does France, but they still kind of pretty much own them economically.
yeah. So like, I'll be honest, I don't know what postcolonialism in general is. So like, let me look that up right now.
They just mean after we just invaded countries and took their resources, but
yeah, but I mean,
we
I think
still
it
do
seems
but
to me
it's
like
different now.
it seems to me like postcolonial theory is far more involved than that.
Postcolonialists, from what I can tell, kind of just want to reverse colonialism or something to end it, to have the self-determination of their people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see. There's this from decolonize.org, little short PDF, an introduction to postcolonialism, postcolonial theory, and postcolonial literature. Where does it come from? Postcolonial literature comes from Britain's former colonies in the Caribbean, Africa, and India. Many postcolonial writers write in English and focus on common themes such as the struggles for independence, immigration, national identity, allegiance, and childhood. What is postcolonial theory? Postcolonial theory is literary theory or critical approach that deals with literature produced in countries that were once or are now colonies of other countries. It may also deal with literature written in or by citizens of colonizing countries that take colonies or their peoples as its subject matter. The theory is based on concepts of otherness and resistance. Postcolonial theory became part of the critical toolbox in the 1970s, and many practitioners credit Edward Said's book Orientalism as being the founding work. Typically, the proponents of the theory examine the ways in which writers from colonized countries attempt to articulate and even celebrate their cultural identities and reclaim them from the colonizers. They also examine ways in which the literature of the colonial powers is used to justify colonialism through the perpetuation of images of the colonized as inferior. However, attempts at coming up with a single definition of postcolonial theory have proved controversial, and some writers have strongly critiqued the whole concept. Okay, so yeah, it's like postmodernism. It's not really definable. It's just they happen to deal with postcolonial issues in some way.
Which means after colonialism. Well, we read that the who was it, Frantz Fanon?
Frantz Fanon, yeah.
On the decolonized subject and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, by the way, we ended up reading that entire chapter, but I didn't record that second session, and
Oh, yeah. I forgot that you didn't record it. So well, yeah, I mean, we're almost halfway done with this one.
1 hour to like read the 3 pages.
Yeah.
I run my mouth too much.
Oh no, I think this is one of our best sessions so far.
I think our discussions have been better than most of the stuff on the actual article anyways.
So a negation of the negation of Hegel, next section. Given its peculiar provenance, it's probably not a revelation that there are important limitations to the rendering of Hegel that is commonplace in postcolonial circles. This is in no small part due to the fact that few critics in the field have been willing to take Hegel's philosophy seriously, preferring instead to rely on cliches or received wisdom. To be sure, Hegel's extraordinary chauvinism makes his often arcane prose even more difficult to endure. Yet it can't explain why it is that, even in the case of a preeminent scholar like Said, the persistence of Hegel seems to come as a surprise. Consider this comment from Culture and Imperialism. Quote, "The irony is that Hegel's dialectic is Hegel's, after all. He was there first, just as the Marxist dialectic of subject and object had been there before the Fanon of Les Damnés, who had used it to explain the struggle between colonizer and colonized." End quote. More than surprise, in fact, what Said's remark betrays is the deep disappointment lodged in the postcolonial psyche. Having to engage with the culture of empire as we resist it cannot be considered a tragedy. Which is, by the way, also brings it back to the philosophy of history. Whose philosophy is being used to critique the problem of freedom of the colonized? The West's. It's a philosophy and the tradition that came out of Western Europe. It didn't come from a Chinese philosophy. It didn't come from a Hindu philosophy. It came from the West. And it can go and incorporate the Hindu and the Chinese philosophy. There's plenty being incorporated. But that drive of the idea of the personal freedom, of the very idea of freedom as such, comes from the West, from this so-called European tradition.
They could. We just don't know about it because it's not like worldly popular, I guess.
Well, no, I mean, come on, it's historically a theme that comes up specifically because of the problems of the West.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get what this whole thing, like, this whole thing of like, I mean, it's like, and
we can provide the best theory for why we failed.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's a Western theory, and who cares? I don't care. Like, I'm not from the U.S. and I'm not white. I am from one of those places that was colonized, and I don't care. If the critique of Europe came from Europe, great. I will use it. It just doesn't matter. If somebody has the ideas, that's just it. Too bad, so sad. Why would you hate that? Why would you care? Oh, it comes from Europe, it's Eurocentric.
I don't think it's like white guilt or, a BP we're sorry type thing.
Well, no, there's nothing to be sorry.
I think it's a genuine critique. Yeah. I think it's genuine.
Well, yeah, it is a genuine critique. What they're critiquing is genuine. This whole thing about the otherness and whatnot, the cultural colonization, the economic colonization, which is the form of colonization nowadays. It's nobody really goes and invades places, and it's like, you're now a colony. You just send them a Walmart and game over, basically.
Mm-hmm. Unless they're Germany, they make their workers, they make Walmart pay their workers adequately. That's what we need. More countries to not be like, okay, we'll take a Walmart.
Yeah, but this whole thing is like, oh, it's from Europe, it's Eurocentric. Well, you're using Eurocentrism to critique Eurocentrism. Irony of ironies, but that's the way you do it, by the way. If you're going to critique something, you critique it from within. But, the fact that this whole issue of these whole problems, this whole obsession, is exactly a Western obsession. Ancient Chinese didn't worry about the problem of individual freedom anywhere to the level that we do, nor did the Hindus. I mean, they had this whole idea, dharma. It's your dharma. It's your duties. It's your place in life. You're born, you do it. Don't worry. If you do it, fine. You'll be reborn next life. You'll be one of the better guys.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. They didn't care so much about political philosophy. Not that they didn't talk about political philosophy. They certainly did. And, they did critique the things that would exist in their own time, but they didn't critique it anywhere near as much as we have come to critique it nowadays. And it's a Western thing. And it's no longer a purely Western thing, by the way. It begins in the West, and it's wrong to call it Western because it's actually universal. But that's exactly what they want to deny. They want to deny that there's any universality. What universalism is this Western idea that's false. But how are you supposed to play that up when that's exactly the thing that grounds your very critiques, that grounds your very process of critique? I mean, because otherwise you go to the actual Nietzschean route and you say, look, fuck your values, fuck your individualism, we're this, we're that, and, and if you want to impose that on us, we'll just fight you for it. We'll fight you off. That's all you can do.
It's just a privileging of the other that's become popular. Like the oppressed can do no wrong type thing,
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of like what is it? I think it's a guy named Davidson.
I forget what it's called. Oh, Davidson?
Well, no, not Davidson. I'm talking about something else. There was a theory for a while called conceptual schemes, and I think it's Donald Davidson that wrote an article about how this just doesn't make sense. It's like, oh, well, we are the radical other, and you Westerners just couldn't understand us. And he's like, well, if that was the case, then how come you can understand us? It seems we understand you. We can talk about your concepts. we may not have your concepts. It doesn't mean that it's unintelligible or anything.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of radical otherness, that there are certain things that just cannot be mediated. There's no middle ground. There's no way to like really integrate them into each other. These what they mentioned in the last section about this idea of real difference. Like we can only do things piecemeal. Take a little bit here and take a little bit, but there's no actual integration that happens within the concept itself. They're too different.
Is that a Swamp Man guy?
What?
There's a Swamp Man social thing.
No idea.
Thought experiment thing. It's probably the same guy.
I mean, it's like, by the way, I mean, it's like we're talking about this. It's related, but imagine like there were like ETs or whatever. There are people who level this exact same thing. Oh, if the ETs came, they'd have such different ways of thinking than us, and we could not understand them. Seems to me, if they're coming to our planet and visiting, they're just dicks. It's not that we can't understand them, they just don't want to tell us. They abduct people, they anally probe them. And some people like make this thing of like, oh, like we are to them as, like a cow is to us. We don't go into the cow and try to explain it why we're like putting a rod up its butt, and like while we're taking its blood, we just do it and we release them, we tag them, and like poor animal doesn't know why, and that's just a stupid analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Fucking aliens, goddamn relativists.
You always have to go back to the fucking aliens.
Are you kidding me? If the aliens came out today, Josh, you bet your ass these people, these post-colonialists and everyone else would have to deal with this question. Yeah. Then it would be real, because like then we really have, for the first time, a real species other who may or may not be more intellectually gifted than we are. And now that's some real otherness. Now that's where like you get this real problem, and you have this real question of like, can we actually understand them? Can we actually mediate with them? Could we really like have this equal interaction with beings that literally may just radically think differently in ways that we cannot conceive? Now that's the real question. This shit about like, oh, the Indians, they just have their own unique way of being and their unique way of thinking, and you Westerners just can't understand, and we just don't want your values, and we don't have to understand your values. Well, fuck that. Of course we can understand each other.
Fuck that. Fucking yeah, I agree. It's just like a reversal thing, where they see that we think that the colonialist thinks themselves superior, and they want to make the colonized subject superior in a way that we can't understand. But
well, there are superior things.
We can all
you can understand each other.
Well,
not only
yeah,
that, like I'm gonna say that there are superior and inferior ways of living and being and thinking, and you bet your ass, if you think in an inferior way, I don't have to accept it.
Yeah.
I don't think you can just steamroll other people, by the way, and like make them change. You certainly can't do that.
No,
but,
it's not possible.
But you bet your ass that if we had like actual sensible and rational relations with the Middle East, we would be doing everything to change their minds about their closed-mindedness. It's not that the Middle East is being complete closed-minded. This is an effect of Western imperialism itself. This radicalization and fundamentalism. But how do you change that? You get the fuck out of there. You can't steamroll them. Say fine. We leave you alone. You let them sort themselves out, and then you start having this this trickle down dialogue of like well, doesn't this not make sense to you? Doesn't this whole thing of subjugation of women not make sense to you? Shouldn't you be equal? What is the inferiority of women? There is no inferior women. You do this rational thing, and people slowly start changing. Like you know what? That's right. And what does that require? Universalism. That's the ultimate thing, universalism. Why would you not want universalism? That's insane. Oh, we want to be Indian, we want to be separate. Why?
Yeah. To preserve their culture.
But why? Like, who the fuck cares?
I know. Yeah, I agree.
there's going to be a point, like let's accept, people have to realize that there's going to be a point in which we're going to be one world, and we're like, that's just going to be it, if unless we nuke ourselves, and like literally die. Then of course, there's not going to be no world to be one with. But if we survive and we get technology and we start going to space, what are you starting to think? We're going to have a one world thinking. We're going to have to think ourselves as Earthlings, and not Indians, not Americans, not Mexicans, and not Hindustani, not whatever, not Chinese, not whatever. You're gonna have to think about it. We're Earthlings. I'm from Earth, and I just live in another different corner of the Earth. It's like me living on a different side of the United States. The East Coast and the West Coast, they're not the same kind of people, and yet they have no problem like recognizing that there's some universality there. We can talk and we can understand each other. We don't agree on everything. We have different tastes and styles, but who cares? We still have that unity.
Different things, but
yeah, so people in the Midwest still call soda pop.
Yeah, want to have a pop,
and who cares?
We think it's silly, but yeah.
Yeah, like there's none of this privileging of difference. If it's there, it's there. Great. If it's not, it's not. Great.
Yeah. Sorry, I just had a weird thought.
What?
What if, like, the people's culture, they feel the same way about it as we do, our cultures? Like, they don't really care about it that much.
But dude, nobody cares about it. Like, yeah. Honestly, okay,
the
like...
revitalization's our fault, as we said earlier. Or the West's fault.
Pretty much.
Sorry.
But I think it's good, ultimately. It's still ultimately good.
Yeah, it's good to know that history, because, by the way, it's an important history, and depending on which side of certain speculative things you fall on, it completely changes the view of human history for some things.
I'm just not, the idea of the noble savage is not one that I think we should privilege, and a lot of liberal type people do.
Or the idea of tradition, like, fuck tradition.
Yeah. Traditions are usually shitty.
I mean, like, yeah, do it for fun, but like, there's nothing like deeply meaningful about it.
Have a detachment from it,
It's like, sure, revive some like, Mayan holiday or something, and like, just don't do the human sacrifice. Don't take it too seriously.
Yeah.
Like, by the way, I mean, like, I like cultural differences. I would be very sad in a world in which we were all burger stannies.
Yeah, it'd be awful.
It's awful to be one already. I mean, you look at stuff like, the carnivals and things that, the great festivals that they have in India. They're beautiful, they're amazing, and, it's great things to have. I mean, you come to the U.S. and what do we have? The Thanksgiving parade.
Well, yeah, the like popular shit is stupid, but the idea of America as a melting pot is a really good one.
Yeah, I wish we celebrated more shit, If you live like, close to certain communities that still maintain certain things, it's great, they like people coming over and, sharing in their culture, as opposed to, those people who talk about cultural appropriation. If the Hmongs, there's a big Hmong population here in Fresno where I am. And
is that a racist term?
No, they're the Hmong people. And there's
Mongolia or what?
No, the Hmong. HMO.
Because I know Hmong is like a Mongoloid.
No, it's HMONG.
Okay.
It's like they're Hmong.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm on board now.
And there's like we have they have their own Hmong New Year. They don't mind if you go over and like take part in the festivities during the Hmong New Years. I mean, they sell food. They bring. They have their own family things, but they also have like an open cultural thing. They sell food. They have like this kind of little bit carnival atmosphere and whatnot. They have shows. They like people who aren't Hmong coming and seeing, engaging. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, like, on the other hand, though, with cultural appropriation, the singer-songwriter Jill Scott Heron, I think he makes a good point. He says in his song, "Ain't No New Thing, why don't they try stealing some of this poverty?" like white people will just like take
yeah.
black culture, they won't even acknowledge it, and they'll keep them living like shit.
I mean, there's a positive appropriation, and there's also a negative appropriation. And there's also an indifferent appropriation. Like the negative appropriation, I think, would be like something like the Indian motif in like American westerns, or this fetishism that some people have. It's like, what is it that you cosplay as an alien? What do you do? Well, you just take their look. Take like the leather clothes. You take the mohawk of the feathers. What do you do? What do you do? You say like, oh well, isn't this cool? I'm an Indian.
Like those music festival people.
I mean, like that's it's sort of like, well, it's not sort of it's either indifferent or just downright disrespectful. And I don't think you should do that, but I also don't think that should be illegal.
Yeah.
I think it's in bad taste. Yeah, I think it's in terrible taste.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's telling of your own ignorance and your own, views of such people.
But what if that's their fashion and they like it? Like, can you reduce it to a fashion like that? Or is that still disrespectful?
Nah, I mean, I wouldn't care. I mean, if everybody started dressing like the Pope, for example, I'd say, go ahead, man, I dig it.
Just makes me think of Jason Unruh, who we, started talking about at the start of this video, and his mohawk.
Is that culturally appropriating my Russian culture because of Zangief?
I don't know.
From Street Fighter 2.
Either way, we got off tangent and
yeah. Okay, give the example of or positive. I would say like the Apu trilogy of Satyajit Ray, where they were flops in India and then they were appreciated in the West, and then they were retroactively given like masterpiece status in India.
Well, is that cultural appropriation? I mean, like, I think the positive appropriation would be like, taking their ideas and like, just acknowledging that there was, you got it from them. Like, the Greeks had no problem saying that, like, all that we know we took from the Egyptians.
Yeah.
It's great. I don't think the Egyptians were going, you stole our ideas. I think they were like...
Because they didn't give a fuck about credit. They were like,
yeah, they were like...
ideas are spreading.
Yeah, they're like, the fucking Greeks learned something from us. See, we're right.
Yeah.
I'd be happy about that.
And they liked the Greeks at first.
Yeah, until they went and took over.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a positive appropriation. There's also like artistic appropriation. It's like I don't think the Indians would mind at all if we made like churches in the style of their temples. I think they'd think it was pretty great. If like a culture has a certain kind of art form, there's nothing wrong with like saying, wow, that's interesting. I like to make something like that. Maybe
imitation is the best form of flattery or whatever.
I don't think everybody appreciates it, but who cares? There's always snobs in societies like, those white people, those white pigus, they just don't understand the essence of kabuki theater. They can't do it. Well, whatever, man.
Just watch Story of the Last Chrysanthemums.
Yeah, and kind of like with this whole cultural appropriation sort of thing, there's an underlying basis for like intellectual property.
Yeah, I mean, like,
I was gonna say that.
This idea belongs to me. This art piece belongs to me.
We don't like that.
Yeah, it's silly. I mean, like, one of the things I think would be like indifferent but also tasteless is like, like, imagine somebody trying to make a Western Chinese epic.
Mm-hmm.
Like with the whole, flying like acrobatic kung fu, but without Chinese people. It's terrible.
Man with the Iron Fist. Yeah.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's like nobody likes it.
With the RZA and that Australian actor, the fighting around the world. But yeah, I don't want to get off into communism, but in communism, the idea of like getting credit for something will be a ridiculous notion. Like, who gives a shit?
Yeah, who gives a shit? We'll all be like telepaths, man. So like, you can't even hide your ideas from me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to be famous. I just want to contribute to the world spirit. I don't want credit for it.
Exactly. personal satisfaction and contribution. That's what the rich should learn. Not gaining ever more money, but, how can I benefit society? I would gain personal satisfaction. I mean, I do, my small contributions. I get more satisfaction from helping out a homeless person than I would, getting first place in a spelling bee or whatever. But that's a tangent. All right, go.
Yeah.
We gonna leave it here or what?
Where were we? Tragedy. The postcolonial Hegel is, in many ways, an effect of this disappointment. So too is the routine conflation. Oh, by the way, let me read the last sentence of the last paragraph, just to make it clear where we ended, and we're continuing. More than surprising, in fact, what Said's remark betrays is the deep disappointment lodged in the postcolonial psyche. Having to engage with the culture of empire as we resist it cannot be considered a tragedy. So, a bit mad that they can't just use their own ideas to fight ours, but they have to use ours to fight theirs. And I say ours because even though we're not all white here, we're all stuck in that Western tradition, and we are part of it, whether we like it or not.
Well, I mean, like what Zorn said, the Western tradition isn't even completely Western anyways.
Yeah, and ultimately it doesn't fucking matter. Because ideas are ideas, whether they're from China or from the West, and if they're good, they're good, and if it's philosophy, it's philosophy. So, so whether you're purely dealing with people who just happen to live in the West, or you're dealing with people who just happen to live in the East, or China, or the South to the North Pole, it doesn't matter. So, continuing, the postcolonial Hegel is in many ways an effect of this disappointment. So too is the routine conflation of Marxism and Hegelianism vis-a-vis their related but distinct conceptions of dialectics, and in turn their imperial tendencies. Certainly it would be unfair to charge thinkers such as Baba and Chakrabarty with reducing the Hegelian dialectic to the familiar thesis, antithesis, synthesis formula. For one thing, as Frederick Jameson has suggested, there is plenty in Hegel's own work to warrant such a reduction. On the other hand, it would be fair to say that these writers hold an exceedingly narrow understanding of Hegel's thought, one which focuses almost exclusively on his apparently single-minded desire to destroy non-European difference. There is more than a little truth to this reading, as our glance at Hegel's Eurocentrism displayed. However, when it leads postcolonial writers to put the accent on Aufhebung and the closure of Hegel's system at the expense of its other dimensions, it threatens paradoxically to foreclose one of the more fruitful possibilities of dialectical thinking. Indeed, this seems to be the purpose of Baba's conclusion that when two opposites encounter each other in the Hegelian dialectic, the result is something which must be contained within them, something which must be returned to the two oppositional principles. We might instead choose to foreground the Hegel from the phenomenology in particular, who retains a tension between identity and difference. This Hegel has a much deeper appreciation for failure and contradiction than his various post-interlocutors have been willing to concede. He also sits uncomfortably with Kojève's suggestion that a dialectical overcoming requires a destruction or annulment of difference. Yeah, okay, so I agree with this entire paragraph. Although, of course, the critique of the postcolonial critique of Hegel is obviously it's wrong, because even in the positive forms, even if Hegel himself doesn't do this, because I haven't read all the positive system of Hegel, so I'm not going to say what he says, and it doesn't fucking matter, but in the logic it's already implied. There's this unity in difference. Can't have that unity, can't have the universality if there aren't actually different people, if there aren't actually different ideas, if there aren't actually different cultures. So yes, it's this tension has to be there. It can't not be there. This harmony is a disharmonious harmony. It's kind of the Hegelian shtick.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we speak of the Eurocentric universalism as opposed to what? There's got to be something to be talked about that was an actual other. The other has to be real. But the point of the sublation at the end of the day is that despite this otherness, we have this unity. That despite that, you like jazz and I hate it, or whatever, or you may
Fuck
like you may like ancient Chinese music and I don't.
Well, yeah,
Nonetheless, we can probably
You have shit
come to
too.
Nonetheless, despite those differences in taste, we can come to some sort of universal agreement of perhaps what art is. Does it mean that we agree completely? No. But
difference
the
in unity.
it's a difference in unity. We may completely disagree in the details. Maybe you are a weeb who thinks that Sailor Moon is like this really deep metaphysical narrative about the
No,
human
that would be
condition.
Una.
Yeah, what is it? Yeah, Una.
Utena.
Yeah, so you may think that's like just a great piece of art, and in your own standpoint, perhaps it really is, and objectively, it may actually fit the standpoint of art. And I just think it's shitty art because it doesn't speak to me. But hey, that's the difference, and that's what life is about. Different strokes for different
variety
folks.
is the spice of life. Oh yeah, we were both trying to say cliche.
Yeah, different strokes for different folks.
See, we even have a difference in analogy or whatever.
Just phrase,
yeah.
I had
But
something
it's
else to
okay.
say, but like now it's gone to my mind.
Because we're best friends. All right.
Yeah, let's continue.
Yeah.
As it stands now, postcolonialism is committed, as we have seen, to the pursuit of a non-Hegelian mode of dialectics, one which refuses any form of mediation. The problem with this project is, first of all, that it is often framed in remarkably Hegelian terms. Thus, when Jung proposes that Foucault's model is an improvement over Hegel's, in that it avoids essentialism, acknowledges the otherness is ultimately ungovernable, he does so by situating Foucault in a historical sequence of theorists, all of whom are assessed according to the degree to which they succeed in overcoming the Hegelian frame of itself. Just a quick note on that. It's literally in the master-slave dialectic. That's exactly Hegel's conclusion. The other is the other, and that's exactly why we can't just dominate over it. It's exactly why you can't ultimately you can't really have this idea in which the slave is purely an object, purely passive, because the truth is that they are a real other, and there's a place there that regardless of what you do, regardless of what you can do, you are not gonna break them.
And in that way, you're a self-other. You're self-othering.
Yeah, and if you recognize that, you have recognized an other as an other. I mean, this is obvious. Imagine like I can give you any kind of rational argument. I can punch you in the face. I can stab you with a knife, and I can shoot you with a gun. But I cannot make you believe or feel any positive emotions. Anyway, you can't make that I want you by any force of any kind. Neither rational force nor physical force. If you don't love me,
without recognition of you as another.
Yeah, not even with recognition. If you don't love me, I can't make you love me.
Oh,
and even you can't make yourself love me. And and if you really believe in God, there's no rational argument. There's nothing I can do to make you stop believing in God. I can kill you, but even that won't change your fucking mind because you're dead. But there's that interiority, there's that otherness which is just impossible to break into, and that's necessary. If you didn't have that, the other could not really be an other. If there's a little thing that I could poke inside your brain or somehow psychically poke inside your mind and make you feel certain things and change you, you are not a real individual to me.
Yeah. The Chinese biogenetic thing that Zizek worries about.
Yeah,
him up, but I'm just thinking about.
Yeah, Zizek talks about that. The horror that there may be physical things that literally one day they might be able to implant a chip in your brain or like do something, and literally just
control the mouse.
Control you like a remote control car. But your experience of it, your experience of it was like, I wanted to do that. I just felt like it. Like, why'd you move left? Well, I just felt like it. Even though, somewhere like 200 miles away, some guy's like in a hidden room, pressing a button, and that's what made you actually want to go left.
Scary, scary thought.
The aliens supposedly also are capable of certain things like that. So, we have to be wary. What if the problem isn't even, between us, and that literally to the aliens, this is the only relation they have to us?
Welcome back to the UFO podcast. No.
I mean, just hypothetically, assuming that
assuming
that the supposed abduction experiences, have anything real about them. Imagine
UFOs for our metaphors for our thought experiment. We just use them as the
imagine somebody imagine because there's something like that. There's plenty of weird shit to be said that that's just metaphysically important. Imagine that somebody couldn't literally implant a thought in your mind and you couldn't tell that there was anything different between you and just like randomly having an insight. What if that happened? That's scary. Now, where's your freedom then? Maybe that's the way the Greys just don't care about us and don't ask us anything, because they don't have any individuality. They don't have that freedom. They're like an open mind. Any one of them could just peek entirely through them and goes like, I know exactly what you're thinking. I know exactly what you're feeling.
On Saturn.
Oh, are you kidding me? They don't live on Saturn. They live on that spaceship around Saturn. It's huge.
The planet, Saturn's moon, Hyperion.
Yeah, they live on our moon. The dark side of the moon. We can't look there with our telescopes, so NASA can just airbrush.
No dark side of the moon, really. Matter of fact, it's all dark.
Okay, we're getting to stupid shit.
Yeah, I know. Okay, let's go.
Back to this. Back to the more mundane things. Continuing, about the overcoming of the Hegelian framework itself. Baba's alternatives are similarly constrained. They take the example of hybridity. In its tripartite form and its pitching of one pole against another in order to produce something else besides, there is more than a passing resemblance to the Hegelian dialectic. Likewise, in the case of mimicry, Baba describes an encounter between colonizer and colonized that contains the faintest trace of the master-slave dialectic. Like Hegel's slave, Baba's colonized subject recognizes in others the colonizer who embodies the being for self he lacks. And while he continues to depend on the colonized for his self-definition, the colonizer, a la Hegel's master, is unwilling to extend reciprocal recognition to him. But the most interesting parallel is that by forcing the colonized to imitate the habits and values of the dominant culture, the colonizer affords a degree of proximity which contains a certain menace to the potential for mockery. To put it in more Hegelian terms, by placing himself in relation of mediation with the colonized in the world of things, the colonizer, like Hegel's masters before him, unwittingly sets the stage for a dialectical reversal in which, to quote Baba, the discursive conditions of dominance turns into the grounds of intervention. Yeah. I mean, of course, there were always curious people, who did these experiments of, what if the Negroes aren't actually stupid? What if we, let's do an experiment, Bentham and Mill. And let's teach this guy everything. See what he does. And I'm saying guy, but
like that one dude, that one philosopher in Germany.
Yeah, you saw that on Twitter. I was not aware about that. A literal professor. They made him the first African philosopher to get a PhD, and they made him a professor at the fucking university. And that was an experiment by the master. He was like, well, let's see what they can do. And they did it. And if they can do that, what does that tell you? If the people in Haiti literally gave philosophical reasons for the revolution, for their necessity of being recognized as equal to the whites, what does that tell you? You can't avoid it. You literally have to stick your hand in the sand and just deny the reality that they weren't other to you. They are of the same kind. And that if you don't recognize them, what's to say that, you have any rational ground to recognize anybody?
Yeah, that's why Jacques Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture fucked them up.
So, so how do you get this? The very contradiction is through this mediation of the universality in which you have to engage in kind. And, it's like there's no surprise at all, by the way, that anybody who tries to get it from Hegel just ends up repeating Hegel because, well, Hegel's that thorough. It's not that he really cared about anticipating all the future people, coming up with these different concepts. And it's like, oh, well, that just happens to be in Hegel. Yeah, it just happens to be in Hegel. I mean, if you deal with fundamental things in systematic, fashion, you're going to hit up just about everything. I mean, it's like finding things in Plato.
Mm-hmm. It's like how people say, "Oh, The Simpsons already did that."
Yeah, it's like
Hegel already did that.
Yeah, it's without intention, and sometimes it's not explicit, but it's implicit. Because every time you try to get away, well, how are you going to get away when, if Hegel's right, and I think he's right, that these categories are intertwined in these ways, the fact that people keep repeating them is just the proof that they really is there. Which requires, by the way, universality. The universality of reason.
They're just embarrassed to be influenced by a white guy. That's what I think it is.
If you can do it better than the white guy, why wouldn't you do it better than the white guy? Let me just tell you. It's like, fine, you go for it. Like, I would be proud of my people if they went, like, you know what? Let's show the white man how democracy is really done.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be great. Of course,
if Honduras went from the murder capital of the world to
a fucking social democracy, to like one of the to be like Denmark, for example, that'd be like fucking world historical.
Yeah.
But then again, you always have to wonder, well, what about Venezuela? What's going on there? Who's at fault? God. Who's at fault for all those problems? Is the U.S. not meddling there? Of course they're meddling there.
Of course they are.
So, can you just decide to up and do this? No. It'd be great if you could, because I think if you could, a lot of people would have done it.
Well, actually in South America, Bolivia has been going on a path similar to Venezuela during their revolution, and they've actually been doing way better. And I've looked at things, and it's because they have much better management of their policies.
Oh yeah, dude.
They have similar policies, like extremely similar, but they just manage it better and save money much more.
I'm gonna have to look into that. Thank you. I was not aware of that.
Good on Bolivia.
Because dude. By the way, the people who says like it's all U.S. meddling, they're fucking. It's obviously wrong. Like there is like huge, like people who live there will tell you, look, there's a huge amount of corruption within the party itself. There's a huge amount of incompetence, and you can tell. I mean, Maduro is not the brightest person.
He's no Chavez.
Yeah, and he's not. He doesn't have the charisma of Chavez, and he doesn't have the intellectual rigor that Chavez has. People think like Chavez was this moron. The guy read a lot. He may not be in like philosopher level mind, but he was somebody who was always trying to learn and understand the world. That's admirable, and that's how you get in a grasp of things. He wasn't dogmatic. There were a lot of Marxists. You would go and visit him, and he wasn't a Marxist himself, but he was open to listening to all these like different socialists. He's like, take these ideas here, take these ideas there. Maybe this works here, and look at your country, and you're like, well, nah, I don't think that's gonna work. Plenty of people are like, you got to get rid of capitalism right now. You got to expropriate the bourgeoisie right now. You got to go to planned economy immediately. Could they fucking do that? No.
And now they didn't have the material conditions.
They don't have the material conditions. Yeah.
But we'll see. I mean, Evo Morales might be the next...
Is he still, is he still president?
Is he still president? I think so, right? Pretty sure, yeah.
I mean, I know, I've seen some posts on Lefty Polo about.
He has been for 20 years, nearly.
Yeah, some people are claiming a little bit of corruption going on in his government. There's always corruption, so I don't give a fuck. People are like, oh my god, they're not a saint. Yeah, what'd you expect?
Yeah, I'm not saying he's absolved, but it could not be his fault. You can't control all the people under you all the time.
Yeah, pretty much. Even if you have the greatest intentions, like there's only so much you can do, and like you got to play with the people who have the power, who have the levers of power, and it's not always in your hands.
Yeah. Also, the CIA trying to assassinate him.
Oh yeah. It's always really disappointing. Not disappointing, but I mean, it makes me like extremely angry about what has gone on in the world, thanks to the meddling of the U.S.
Yeah, he's in his third term. Dictator. No. I don't give a fuck about dictatorship. I know we talk about this, but
people are like, oh my god, they have been there for 20 fucking years. Yeah, they're fucking popular.
Okay, if they do a good job, who gives a shit?
I mean, like, only the U.S. has this fucking, like, phobia of, like, oh my god, they've been there for their entire life. Yeah, if you're good, why would you change it?
It's only because the right didn't want...
Yeah, they didn't, like, they changed it because they didn't want... The Democrats are always more popular.
Yeah.
They didn't... I mean, who was...
They didn't want an FDR again.
Yeah, FDR was there for, like, 4 terms.
Yeah.
And had he survived, he would have been there till the end of his days.
Yeah.
The most popular president there's ever been... Who would change it?
Yeah, FDR was pretty good, but I have like a few complaints with him.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
There's always complaints, man.
The internment camps, kicking out that communist vice president.
Yeah.
Screwing over the black
he
people.
did some things which are like just historically shady. I mean, which he just sabotaged himself. It seems like it was self-sabotage. Like how there's no other way to explain it. It was like he didn't want to do certain things that he had promised to do. So he made sure that certain things would happen so that he wouldn't be able to do them. Like, for example, like trying to pack the Supreme Court, when he already had the majority.
Mm-hmm.
And that created a whole scandal which, took the pressure off his hands for some other social things that people wanted him to do.
Yeah.
But whatever, let's continue. So, despite their best efforts, postcolonial critics have not been able to leave Hegel behind entirely. Indeed, producing a non-Hegelian model, as Bhabha claims to want to do, may, strictly speaking, be impossible. In order to conceive of something that is fundamentally un-Hegelian, one must imagine differences that are not in relation. This means positing a realm of radical otherness, a realm of difference as such, which is impervious to thought itself. According to Peter Hallward, this is both the purpose of postcolonial theorizing and its central contradiction or confusion. Conventionally, he observes, the postcolonial is framed as the search for more historically specific or situated forms of knowledge production. The use of apparently relational terms such as hybridity, particularity, otherness, heterogeneity, and so on serve to reinforce this presentation. Against this view, Hallward argues that postcolonialism is not in truth concerned with difference or what he calls the specific. Rather, it is engaged in a struggle to think the singular. That is to say, it seeks a logic of individuation which neither relies on nor even refers to a reality which exists outside of itself. Hence, postcolonial theory is best understood as a sort of general theory of the non-generalizable. To make matters worse, the singularizing orientation of postcolonial writers and critics involves not only a rejection of relationality and specificity, but an active transcendence of it. This is, of course, the very thing that Bhabha, Chakrabarty, and others find objectionable about the Hegelian dialectic. And that's exactly the problem. You can't think individuality. Individuality is the enemy of thought. It's literally unthinkable.
Yeah.
At least, in the usual way people think about it. Hegel finds a way to do it, and I think it works perfectly well.
Yeah.
And he shows how it is intelligible and what it is that how it is that we are actually able to think the individual through the universal.
Yeah, through consideration of everything else.
Even if the effort to think, good.
Yeah. Oh no, go on.
Even if the effort to think the absolutely singular is a worthy pursuit, a postcolonialism which concerns itself with nothing else is nonetheless worthy of suspicion. The effort to engage the singular as purely singular is mysticism, and there's a reason it's called mysticism.
Yeah.
This is because, while it might well preserve a certain autonomy for questions of culture, it is bound to have disastrous implications for conceptualizing politics which reaches beyond this sphere. this sphere. It is here where we can see a marked distinction between a post-colonial approach, in its current formulation at least, and an anti-colonial one. Whereas post-colonialism has confined its politics to the realm of representation and the subjective effects of imperialism and colonialism, anti-colonial thinking is equally concerned with the socio-historical dimensions of oppression. While the writing of post-colonial theorists often slips into what Fred Dallmeyer, weird spelling, has called an intellectual nomadism or an indifferent cosmopolitanism. The work of authors such as Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire recognizes the importance of retaining the antagonism and even binarism of the colonial encounter. Indeed, the explicitly revolutionary disposition of anti-colonial thought requires terms which are specific and relational rather than singular. In short, while post-colonial thinkers eschew dialectics and other Hegelian ideas such as the universal history, anti-colonial writers have understood that these are essential tools in the struggle to overcome the current global order. Some form of dialectical thinking, and therefore some engagement with the work of Hegel and Marx, seems necessary to formulate a genuinely emancipatory project. How else can we understand historical progress if not through the overcoming of social contradictions? Whatever the problems with Hegelian philosophy of history, it cannot simply be pitched out without also renouncing the telos of social transformation. And yet a straightforward return to Hegel, one which does not negotiate the Eurocentrism of his system, is today neither possible nor desirable. In this respect, Baba's ambivalence appears entirely justified. We are at an impasse in which Hegel's legacy is something we can neither live with nor without. I suppose. I mean, it's no different than anybody else, quite frankly. I don't see why people think, like, oh, well, it's the problem of Hegel. Can't do that with anybody.
Yeah.
At all. No one, not even not a modern thinker, not Plato from 2,000 years ago, not the Egyptians. Of course, you can't just go and just take their system and go, well, we're just going to use this. Can't work that way. It doesn't happen. We don't live their world. We don't live their lives. We have different problems, different issues, and we have different knowledge. We have a grander picture of the world, far more detailed in various ways. And there's plenty of things in them that we can learn and we can take, but we can't take them all wholesale.
Yep. That's why we think Orthodox Marxism is just good intentioned. It's naive.
Yeah, it's also the same, like, anybody who wants to be an Orthodox Hegelianism, what kind of stupidity is that?
Yeah. You're not learning anything new. You're not presenting anything new.
Yeah, which is probably like one of my issues with Hegelian scholarship. Almost nobody actually is there's almost no real Hegelians. Mm-hmm. There are people who repeat and regurgitate and re-explain what Hegel said, but they're not doing any actual philosophy.
As long as they're doing it right, but yeah.
Yeah, but they're not doing anything. Yeah, they're not doing anything new.
That's why we praise Marx and Winfield.
Yeah, Marx actually did something. Marx was actually Hegelian. He did something Hegelian. He did new philosophy. That was genuine. But once
Winfield
and Winfield, he's rethinking Hegel. He's not just taking Hegel's word for it. He's like, let's update Hegel to the modern day. Some things people disagree with, some things I might not agree with, but either way, he's doing philosophy. He's doing something new with, using the method of the old. Bringing in the new information, bringing in the new understanding, reformulating, restructuring, because that's what you got to do. Hegel himself tells you that. He's like, everything has to be redone for every historical epoch. Mm-hmm. If something new comes about and it changes the entire system, so be it. It's got to be done.
Richard Wolff is doing that too. He talks about how people, like, when he goes on Fox News, they're like, oh, you're a Marxist. He's like, yeah, but Marxism's changing. It has to change with the times. We can't just inject Marx from 1850 into the modern day.
Yeah, I mean, it's also the issue.
That's why I support revisionism.
Well, you don't have to you don't have to support it. I mean, it's just going to happen. It's the nature of things. It's going to change.
I observe revisionism as a historical necessity.
So, people are like, oh, well, some people are like, Hegel's logic is outdated. One, they haven't fucking read it, so it's pretty much nobody has succeeded at that thing. But they're like, oh, the philosophy of nature. Look at that. Hegel believes in alchemy and all these other things. One, it's a lot more in depth than you think. And
You
there's
don't know.
there's rationalism. There's a reason to it. You know, it makes sense. But at the same time, it's like, sure, fine. It doesn't make sense. It's outdated. Great. Throw it away. Let's do it again.
Yeah, I don't like the idea of people seeing something cherry picking and then like, oh well, I can dismiss them wholesale.
Yeah, you know, it's like, let's take what works there and what's not working, let's reformulate it. Because we can and we should. You know, they're like, oh, Hegel was, you know, he thought that Prussia was the end of history with the philosophy, right? Whether he did or did not, I don't give a fuck.
Yeah. I don't think so.
You know,
but...
I want to take what works there, what is true there, and bring it to the modern day. And go, okay, what does that look now? What does that look like now? You know, what does the state of right look like if we bring in what we have learned from the modern world, what we have learned in modern history?
Yeah. You should never take anyone in absolute seriously, but you should never dismiss anyone either.
Yeah, I mean, it's like people working with capital. Like, you know,
I mean, you'll never be able to like anyone. Gandhi was a hypocrite. Malcolm X beat his wife.
Marx was an asshole.
Yeah, Marx was an asshole.
I mean, like just being honest, you know, if it was like who would you rather be friends with, like Marx or Hegel? Like Hegel, Hegel is actually a pretty chill guy, pretty cool guy. Marx was a fucking asshole.
Well, yeah, but Hegel would like fuck my wife or something.
Yeah.
He just fucked his landlady, which so did Marx. Oh no, he didn't fuck his landlady. Marx fucked his maid. Hegel fucked his landlady.
Yeah, and maybe his sister.
He didn't do that.
I know.
Though there was a very strange relationship between him and his sister. I don't think he's had that relationship with her, but
no.
She definitely had some feelings towards him, which were like stronger than usual, one would expect. Though I don't know. There's really like nothing left other than like some people would say it's like and you're like, okay, man, whatever.
Well, judge not, and so on.
Okay, so continuing. Working through Hegel. If what is needed at this historical and theoretical juncture is a new Hegel, Professor Buckmore's recent work, Hegel High T and Universal History, offers us some promising leads. In, quote, Hegel and High T, the article's Hegel and High T, the first of the two essays which make up the volume, she asks a question common to the Hegel scholars: where did Hegel's idea of the relation between lordship and bondage originate? However, her more specific and provocative interest is why, in over 2 centuries of Hegel scholarship, few have dared to suggest that the inspiration for Hegel's master-slave dialectic was in fact the Haitian Revolution. The evidence is clear. Hegel knew. His account of the master-slave relation did not derive from the events of the French Revolution, the writings of Plato and Aristotle, nor is it a totally abstract example, all theories which Hegel experts have been willing to entertain. Instead, the slaves from whom Hegel refers were real slaves revolting successfully against real masters. Why make the effort to salvage this fragment from the dustbin of history? Because by correcting the narratives told by the victors, we are one step closer to rescuing the idea of universal human history from the uses to which white domination has put it. Yeah, I mean, and like, I think that's interesting.
Talking about Spartacus.
Yeah, you know, like it's an abstract idea. It's an abstract idea, but so, you know, I don't think that it's really hard to imagine. Well, you know, he just uses an abstract idea because he doesn't talk about any specifics. But at the same time,
tear off your shackles of repression, kill the snarling jackal. I think he's talking. Nah, I'm just kidding. Go on.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, you know, you look at the cultural influences at the time. What was going on in world history? Yeah, there are some pretty strong reasons to believe. You know, so why would he be thinking about this specific relation? Well, you know, it was in the news. It was big news.
Yeah, it was well known.
So, you know, why wouldn't he be thinking about it in this form? So, you know, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. It definitely brings in a moment of history in which, you know, the so-called African race steps into, you know, become world historic, adds a universal dialectical dimension, instantiated in the moment.
Where the Polish soldiers are sent to Haiti by Napoleon, and they hear them singing La Marseillaise, and they switch sides. So good.
There you go, recognition.
Yeah.
So continuing, as a critique of the Eurocentrism of Hegel scholarship, Hegel in high tea has earned praise from postcolonial types. Unsurprisingly, though, the call for resurrecting the project of universal history has not met the same warm reception. Part of the reason is that the essay does not directly take on the postcolonial complaint with the Hegelian philosophy of history. The objection to universal history is not specifically about its content, in this case the rightful place of high tea, but instead its form. But differently, we cannot correct the mis- and under-representation of marginalized voices by democratizing historiography, by moving from bad to good histories. The problem is more serious because, as Chakrabarty points out, the, quote, exclusions are ultimately epistemological, end quote, and thus encoded into the project of universal history itself. This is the source of the postcolonial suspicion of the mediating power of the universal. There are modes of constructing and relating to the past, myths, epics, legends, and so on, which do not conform to the conventions of historical knowledge. In many cases, these alternative forms of memory ascribe agency to gods, spirits, ancestors, and other supernatural forces. The process of translating these subaltern pasts into the secular, empty, and homogeneous time of history involves depopulating them of their divine presences. It means anthropologizing those who do not share the same knowledge of protocols. Understood in this way, universal history cannot be but a false universal. It cannot but entail the sacrifice sublation of cultural difference. From this perspective, even critical histories which challenge dominant and Eurosecond narratives remain, in terms of their epistemological framework, in collusion with empire. To say something about the philosophy of history, I don't know what people's problem is, but I think this has to be one of the most obvious, and I've heard this from people who are just average people, that the obvious end of history would be freedom. Why? Where else is history moving towards? Where else would be progressing towards? What has been building towards? I mean, literally, our history has been a history of increasing freedom. Regardless of what people say, it's like, oh, well, it's all more of the same. We still have the rulers and the ruled, and nothing is different. Fuck you. It's very different. We are in a far better position nowadays than ever in history before.
Yeah.
Without question, despite all the horrors, despite all the history, despite all the stupid bullshit that we have done to each other, we have globally learned. We're getting better. And what are we learning about? Freedom. And what does freedom imply? It implies this whole series of recognition. We recognize each other, we recognize our differences, and we recognize, okay, we're not going to kill each other, and we're not going to,
it's an unconditioned universal.
Yeah, so, when Hegel has the project of the philosophy of history, that's what it's about. You can disagree.
History, spirit realizing itself,
which is freedom.
Spirit's, freedom coming to be.
Yeah, and what is freedom? Why does he talk about it in the form of states? Because that's what real concrete freedom has to look like. You got to have a
state plus state is the people's will manifest.
Yeah, you got to have a society geared towards freedom. Each society that he goes through, each state, is, it has some form of freedom. And each one that goes further has a further form of freedom. Yeah. And, we go back around and, you don't have to use the states that he uses. He uses the ones which are more famous. And I don't see why you would bother doing anything else. But you can totally go ahead and write these vast histories. I mean, of like, oh, look, this was what was happening. They had this form over in America. They had this form, at this time. They had this form at this time. And, you can do it. You can totally do it. And it'd be legit. And you know what? I think it'd be great. I think if somebody was actually interested, it'd be great if somebody did it. The whole thing needs a rework. It needs an expansion. It needs to be reworked immensely.
We'll do it eventually.
But the project is totally legit. I mean, I don't see why else. What else do you think history's about? If you don't think there's anything to history, well, then you don't believe there is such a thing as history then.
Yeah, and if you don't think there's such a thing as philosophy, well, that's the only thing that can bring about self-determination, self-reflection, and so on.
Yeah, you don't believe
I always maintain
truth or freedom.
That the mission of philosophy was and always will be, until it happens, to emancipate people from their alienation, their self-alienation.
Yeah, it brings to you the ideal form of freedom, and what does that lead you to do? That if
whatever
you really, if you are, well, no, if you are really somebody who's thinking fully concretely, it's going to immediately posit for you the end towards which you actually have to materially strive for.
Yeah.
You don't just sit on your ass and say, wow, I figured it out. Great. I'm free in my mind. But you know that's not
maximum potential.
Yeah, it's like the obviously rational like conclusion of all of that is like, great, I know what freedom is. Time to be free. And how do you do that? The way to do that is you got to make yourself free. And you don't do that alone. So there's that. The second and more recent essay in Professor Buckmore's book addresses many, if not all, of these concerns. As the title Universal History implies, this piece does not surrender the idea of universal history or its humanist foundations, nor does it reject in toto the Hegelian dialectic. However, Professor Buckmore's does frame her return to these notions in a way that is certain to be more palatable to those she refers to as the academic critics of Eurocentrism. To begin with, she is careful to distinguish her understanding of universal history from the systematized and homogenizing version generally associated with Hegel's philosophy. Because we do not yet know how to think globally, she writes, we can only proceed toward the universal by working through the specifications of our own traditions. That's bullshit. Oh, we don't know how to think universally. What? We don't know what freedom is. Pretty sure we do. I mean, I'm pretty sure most people don't, but they have some idea of it. And, we can concretize that pretty well.
We do. I would say she's right on the whole, that we, quote unquote, the populace, the mass, do not know how to think globally. I mean, just go to any parade or football game.
But I mean, she's talking to the academics, so I think that this is not talking about those people.
I don't know. I don't think she's talking about academics, but I haven't read that one, but I've read her other work.
Well, I'm saying she's talking to the academics, so my assumption is that she must be talking about the presuppositions of the academics. Indeed, many academics don't know how to think globally. Yeah, it could
Probably
be.
them too, but yeah. She's talking about society.
So, because we do not yet know how to think, this means that while we can and must point to the direction of a universal history, we cannot decide in advance what this will look like, nor can we presume that what it means to be human is everywhere one and the same. Of course, that seems like banal, but I mean, of course, she's dealing with people who are not exactly, fans of Hegel, we are. But you read Hegel and you get the impression, you get this idea that, of course that's just the case. Why is China at the beginning of history? Because they had a different idea of what it was to be human. Why are we at the end of history? Because we have a different idea of what it is to be human. And let me tell you, I think we even as shitty as the U.S. is, we do have a better idea of what it is to be human than China does even today. Because China literally is the totalitarian thing that everybody thinks that the U.S. is.
Yeah.
And I will say it, the U.S. has a better system than they do. They have certain things which are more for utilitarian ends of, control and stability, which are better. But as far as the ideals of freedom, as far as the cognizance of freedom, they are behind. And they are not yet the end of history. In the present sense.
They are afraid of their people.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when you have to they have to have this whole thought control thing. The U.S. has the whole thought control thing too, by the way, but they're more sly about it, and therefore they kind of make it work a little bit better.
Yeah, it's more of a Brave New World type.
But nonetheless, in the U.S., you're not going to the state is you figured out the whole plot. Nobody's going to believe you. Nobody cares. Go ahead and talk about it.
Yeah.
You're not going to go to jail. You're not going to do anything.
I mean, they used to have to, but
yeah, but
they don't have to
because because we're powerless.
This Brave New World was right.
So let's
you
continue.
Just flood it with information, and then it gets lost.
So accordingly, the conception of historical time that is mobilized is not the secular, empty, and homogeneous one criticized by postcolonialists like Chakrabarty, but rather that of porous and unbounded space. This style of thinking acknowledges not only the contingencies of historical events, but also the indeterminacy of the historical categories by which we grasp them. Totally un-Hegelian. I get why she does that. Think she's wrong. Some might complain that this formulation brings us dangerously close to an indifferent cosmopolitanism. But crucially, against the prevailing attitude in postcolonial studies, the position advanced here is not one that simply recognizes the multiplicity of alternative modernities, one which consigns itself to a politics of diversality or multiversality. Why do people make up words that you could just say diversity and
Yeah.
multiplicity?
I don't know. Yeah.
Fucking academics. This is why I don't join that world.
Diversality and multiversality. There are multiple universes possible that we could approach, multiple futures. Whereas Mark Fisher says there's no future.
Whereas, the future people have already come here.
Oh, yeah.
Instead, it involves a relationship between the universal and the particular. Okay, so the universal is particular. This, of course, means
talking
reaffirming...
about the lower universality, right? Lower universal. Not the total universal in particular, obviously.
Yeah, this is the typical understanding of universal in particular. Yeah. This, of course, means reaffirming a commitment to dialectics, although the Hegel under whose sign this is organized is quite distinct from the postcolonial one. It is no doubt clear by now that for Young, Paba, and Chakrabarty, and numerous others, the Hegelian dialectic is characterized by the closure involved in the process of ablation or Aufhebung. Here, an overarching concept takes precedence over the facts on the ground of what Hegel once described as lazy existence. For Professor Buck-Moores, on the other hand, this narrow view of the dialectical procedure ignores its relentless movement. That is to say, for her, the dialectic is characterized not by its success, but by its ability to discipline, contain, or move beyond particularity, but by its repeated failure to do so. In light of this, the only universality we can hang our hats on is one which operates in the register of the negative. Rather than repeating the sins of the past by once again imposing an ethnocentric version of the universal, this form of universality exposes the failure of particular visions to live up to their own universal claims, and in this true dialectic, true in the sense that it is not cut short, it is only the universal which mediates the particulars. It is not only the universal which mediates the particulars, as postcolonial theorists often complain, but also vice versa. A universal history becomes possible by attending to the edges of systems, the limits of premises, the boundaries of historical imagination. Only here, we are told, can we glimpse a common humanity which exceeds cultural limits. Seems right. The phrasing seems... more agreement than disagreement.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of the academic critics of Eurocentrism will be swayed by this offering, and many will likely recoil at its call for a new humanism. Still, there is, as Professor Buck-Moores reminds us, an urgency to this project. In the face of increasingly global challenges and the persistence, and in some cases, expansion of exclusionary modes of collective belonging, we need to find a theoretical orientation which can inform global action. A return to universal history and other Hegelian, or perhaps better, post-Hegelian ideas, is not only possible but crucial in this regard. We cannot, after all, move toward common horizons without stories and concepts which help us explain the worldwide interactions of diverse peoples. Oh, there was a footnote earlier. 35. What was that? That is... to say, for her, Buck-Moores, the dialectic is characterized not by its success, but by its ability to discipline, contain, or move beyond particularity, but by its repeated failure to do so. That is, she's critiquing the view that they have the dialectic. And the footnote is, in a similar vein, Slavoj Žižek asks, and read that in Žižek's voice, why don't you?
Quote,
yeah.
Does not Hegel's phenomenology of spirit tell us again and again the same story of the repeated failure of the subject's endeavor to realize his project in social substance, to impose his vision on the social universe? I can't do this anymore. The story of how the big other, the social substance, again and again thwarts his project and turns it upside down. That's from Mistakeless Subject.
Yeah, that was good.
All right.
So continuing back again. Moreover,
I had something to say, but I forgot what it was. No.
Okay, well, if you remember.
Wait.
So.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I mean, I've been calling for this for a long time. The new human, but also like what I call die neue Leitkultur, the new leading culture. We have to change the way humans perceive themselves and society. Otherwise, nothing's going to change, really. Like communism will not come about.
We need to do what the proletariat we're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Except you gotta find a way to get at people.
Mm-hmm.
And you also can't just be a purely ideas person. You gotta have something.
Yeah. They tried with the new Soviet man and woman, but I don't think it worked at all.
Oh, yeah, I mean, did they really try hard enough? Though?
No, not really. There were many forces trying to prevent it too.
Yeah, Stalinism pretty much killed all of them.
I mean, like, what was it? Yeah, I think like all of it was like part of the prolet cult, which
yeah, the prolet cult.
Richard D. Wolff has a book about that like set of years in which like it was amazing. Everything was up for grabs. Everything was about to change.
Mm-hmm.
Like they had all these ideas, like how do we get rid of like the division of labor between like husband and wife or whatever. And they're like, oh, we know how to do it. We'll just like outsource that to someone else. Somebody's gonna do the cleaning anyways. Might as well pay somebody. So and they had this whole idea, and it was like not just like, oh well, we'll just employ a ton of people to come and clean people's houses. No, they even thought of like, how do we mechanize this? How do we reduce the labor? And like, oh, we'll set like these chutes inside like each apartment complex, in which like it's like a giant vacuum, and all that the people who clean will do is like they'll come in, they sweep things into the vacuum hole, and then the whole thing's vacuum is sucked out onto just one giant trash can machine, and like a couple of people can clean an entire apartment complex pretty quickly, pretty easily. The whole laundry thing, like what do? It's just put somebody's gonna be. A couple of people are going to be doing that job like full time, and you just throw things down the chute and it goes down. You go work. What about the cooking? It was like restaurants. We're just going to have a corner kitchen. Either you can buy it from someone else, or you can just go there and pay for the ingredients you want. Cook your meal right there. You don't have to cook it at home. Everything's already hot and ready. Everything's warmed up. Just put it in the pot, fire on the grill, whatever. Great ideas. I mean, they really had an intention to change things, and like I think had they done it, they would have changed it.
Now we'll never know.
Now we have fucking McDonald's.
Yeah.
Disgusting, greasy
McDonald's
food.
in Moscow.
All right. Okay. Moreover, the pervasive mistrust of universals among the Euro-American academic left does not change the fact that they are nevertheless constantly being renegotiated. Recently, an acknowledgement of the inadequacy of, quote, sheer conflict of perspectives, end quote, has come from an unexpected place. In an article entitled The Public Life of History, Chakrabarty concedes that because of the looming environmental crisis, which affects humans not only in ways specific to their many ways of being in the world, but as species, a simple dismissal of universal theorizing is no longer tenable. Faced with the increasing scarcity of resources necessary for human life and the need for these to be equitably distributed, the possibility emerges of thinking about the general or the universal once again. We are reminded, however, that recognizing the need for universals does not mean abandoning our healthy skepticism about them. We need a new language, a new theory of politics toward which a negative universal history may offer at first step. Let me tell you, if what hangs in the balance is your feelings and special snowflake status of like, oh, I'm in my own individual culture, and we run things in India the Indian way, and we're all gonna fucking die because water's scarce and food is becoming scarce, and we gotta plan everything pretty damn well. Let me tell you, I will go with a dictator who like brings his boot on you and makes you get into the system.
Yeah, I'll quote Zizek here: living with the state is difficult, living without a state is even more difficult.
The reason we need new or renewed conceptual tools... Oh, sorry.
What? That was right?
No, I missed a sentence. We need a new language, a new theory of politics toward which a negative universal history may offer a first step.
Yeah, I read ahead, so I missed it when you skipped it.
Negative universal history.
Yeah.
The reason we need new or renewed conceptual tools, I have attempted to explain, is that postcolonialism has not thus far provided us with adequate ones. By privileging epistemic over institutional violence and cultural rather than more antagonistic forms of resistance...
Wait, what does she mean? She's saying we need to acknowledge that the past was bad and not to do that?
The negative universal history thing? I don't know.
Yeah. That's what I'm getting at.
I mean, as opposed to
There's a
positive
footnote.
universal, as opposed to positive
There's a
universal
footnote.
history. 39. 40 for
Yeah,
an
40.
elaboration of this concept with reference to the work of Theodore Adorno and Walter Benjamin, see Antonio Y. Vasquez Arroyo, Universal History Disavowed, one on critical theory and postcolonialism.
Okay.
I mean, I suppose it's simply like, oh, there's no end to history that we know of. It's just what she was talking about earlier. So it would be a history of development, but development towards what we don't fucking know. So it's open, meaning negative. It's still open for change.
Okay, good. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, to me it just seems like somebody who's like not willing to bite the bullet on what the implications.
Well, it functions nonetheless.
So, by privileging epistemic over institutional violence and cultural rather than more antagonistic forms of resistance, it has shown itself to be politically insufficient. And yet what postcolonial thinking still has to offer is the caution that we must work through cultural and other particularities on the road to universals that are worthy of the name. The problem with postcolonial studies is that far too few in the field have shown an interest in this new compass heading. If it is to extend in its critical yield beyond its concerns with the politics of representation, if it is to prove capable of theorizing the various dimensions of postcolonial subjugation, postcolonial criticism will need to move past its singularizing orientation toward a more relational conception of difference. Of course, this means it will also need to avow its Hegelian foundations. As I have hopefully shown, it may not be possible, or more importantly, desirable to escape Hegel, at least not all of him. A more fruitful avenue might be to approach him with postcolonial patience, that is, to work through his contradictions and political pimples. Indeed, this is one of the lessons we can learn from Professor Buckmore's book, that while we may be stuck with Hegel, we can rework him for a new moment.
But we're stuck with Professor Buckmore. She's white, too. She's a Westerner.
Nothing European, kid. So
forgot about that.
So okay, I thought that was pretty good. I mean, I can't say I know nothing in postcolonial theory, so I definitely know more about it now than I did before. I can't say I found the project honestly meaningful to me. It's definitely meaningful, and I think that this last paragraph really gets at the meaning of what's important in it, and I think what's important in it is very important, but also as well, you know, to each his own, and whatever they find important, and you know, they flesh out. But this whole idea of like, well, we got to work with difference. Of course, you can't just stomp on people and say change your ways. It doesn't happen. Never works ever. People change as they want to change and as they come to change. You can't force it. You can't go to India and say you got to become Western now. Get rid of this stupid Dharma shit. Get onto philosophy and whatnot. That's not how change happens. The cultural change is indeed this dialogue. It has to be. People will change as they want. Yeah, I mean, well, no, it has to be. It doesn't always happen that way. Yeah, it doesn't always happen that way.
It has to, and it shouldn't happen that way. It's a good thing that it doesn't, because if it did, then we would lose a lot of things that are useful. Yeah, and how does it that we come to this universalizing truth? To the true universal. Because we do have this ground of reason, we taught to them and they taught to us, and you're like, you have a point. This is irrational what we're doing, and they look at our music. Sorry, go on. So you look at their ideas, you look at their cultures, and sometimes you're like, they have something that we don't, and you bring it back, and the immediate reaction is like, oh, that's an Indian idea, that's just Eastern. Sometimes they might actually attack you, like fetishizing the other. Sometimes that's true, sometimes that's false. Sometimes the other has a genuinely new idea that's pretty damn good. Something that's a cultural practice that's pretty damn good. Yeah. And how are you gonna change that? It takes time. But what people don't realize is that these changes, especially in the modern day, they happen amazingly quickly. Like amazingly quickly. I mean, just like a couple of decades. Mm-hmm. Just keep having people exposed to these ideas. If it's a good idea, it's gonna get through. It's not easy, but it's gonna get through
one way or another. It's like freedom. You think that the people in China don't know that they're unfree? Oh, they know they're unfree. They're kind of like us and you, everywhere else, in which you're unfree, but you're afraid to do anything because it could be worse.
Yeah.
But they know they're unfree. They can tell. And where do these ideas come from? They're interested. It's like a lot of the elites in China. What are they interested in? Like Western ideas of individualism, Western ideas of individual freedom. Do they obsess about it too much? Probably. Is it something that they need? Absolutely. Should they have it? Hell yeah. And these people are like, well, those are Western ideas, Western individualism. But why is it a thing? Why are people interested? Because there's something true about it. So, and they learn from us, we learn from them. We change at uneven paces. We change in our own ways, and we have this melding. Eventually, you're forced by the reality of content and the reality that you are more connected than you are willing to admit, because, the economic connection is huge. It impacts immensely. If China suddenly became like actually socialist and provided like living wages for its people and demanded, said, hey, you can't fuck us anymore, Walmart. You can't just pay us $1.50 anymore.
Global consciousness would occur.
What's the first thing to do? Well, the people are just like, what? It's like, we're not going to pay that much. Jobs come back to the U.S. Whatever. But, suppose they maintain in China says, well, whatever, Americans, we have your factories, fuck off. Yeah, we'll just make for ourselves. And what are they going to do? They're going to do exactly that. And, just take our factories. Like, they're like, good luck. And, what's the U.S. going to do? Is like, oh, we're going to have a war. Chinese are like, go ahead, try.
Bring it, bitch.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, go ahead, try. They're not like anybody's like lapdog.
And then.
So what happens, then people see like, oh, hey, if China can have a better lifestyle than us, like, what the fuck is wrong with us? That's kind of the way it goes.
By global consciousness.
Yeah, so the global consciousness possibilities go.
China, unfree communist China, is getting better living conditions than us. Hey, what about us?
Yeah, so so it's not simply
happen with actually existing communism in the past.
Well, because it wasn't actually communism, and like most of them like had quite miserable lives, quite honestly. They had better lives than before, and yet the lives were inferior in many ways to what the Westerns had. I mean, the fact like you had this huge repressive state of like you had thought crimes basically. I mean, you did that happen here too, but not to the extent that it was over there.
Yeah, you just gotta be honest about each.
So the idea is if the goal is freedom, right? And the goal isn't just this kind of freedom as opposed to other freedoms. The goal is total like real freedom. And insofar like why did the Soviet Union fall? It wasn't simply because of economics. It was because it was just spiritually bankrupt. People realized they weren't free, and people were sick of it. I mean, like you think it's not important that that you can voice your opinions freely, and yet it's a stupidly important thing that we value a lot more than people realize. People like there's a need to feel that you have that freedom, even if it's meaningless. In the U.S., everybody knows you can say whatever the hell you want. The government doesn't care. Why? Because you have no power. They don't care what you say as long as you have no power. And people go ahead and say things despite knowing that they have no powers, but it makes them feel good. There's a psychological validation going on between that, and it's a real freedom. And people are like, well, it's a false freedom. No, it's a real freedom. It's not a complete freedom, but it's a real freedom. It's a small one, but it's a very important one.
It's not as important as, say, the alt-right or whatever wants
that's the whole other thing. But like, it's an important freedom. So when people go like, well, like the material freedom is more important. No, not really. It's more basic. We need to definitely have it. But when it comes to people's ideas of like, I'd rather starve or close my mouth, it takes a lot for them to choose. I'd rather close my mouth.
Mm-hmm. We also have to consider women's freedom, yes, but for whom to do what? For whom everyone to do what? Not to get something over on another person or whatever.
Yeah, the whole thing of concrete freedom is like, it's not this abstract freedom of like I get to do whatever the fuck I want. Freedom of speech is not this abstract, whatever comes out of your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
Zizek
not
said that
being allowed to. Freedom of speech doesn't mean getting to go into, the wrong neighborhood and yelling the N-word without any consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Zizek said for the Mensheviks, they thought their freedom was to undermine the workers and the peasant government on behalf of the counter-revolution. That's not a freedom, obviously. So you gotta be careful when you say, this is my freedom, or this is my right. Is it universal? If it's not, then it's not genuine freedom or right.
Well, yeah, and that requires, historical hindsight, and things are different, on the ground. And, when you have a real contest of right, the whole issue is, well, who's right? And you don't know that at the moment. I mean, like, there's like moments in which, like, what was it, that thing about London we watched, the British one? It's an episode or something.
Yeah. It was an episode of Fall of Eagles.
Yeah, I mean, it's the story, and you said the story about like that one guy who's like, whose wife killed herself because, the guy,
a comrade who killed herself because a guy criticized her, said she was a whore.
Has slandered her, and like and people, someone like, what was it, her husband, that went to like try to talk with Lennon about it.
Yeah, I believe so.
And like Lennon says, like, I don't fucking care. It's just a woman. I'm not gonna throw away that comrade because he's too useful.
Yeah.
There is a legitimate way to say, like, how the hell can you be a leader with that? And the ultimate truth is that there is no justification ultimately at all. People want to say, well, but they were they had more utility. Yeah. That's not really justification. It happened. What happened. And history took its course, but there is no justification. There's no excusing that kind of thing. It's a bit inhuman. But I agree with at least what's portrayed here about postcolonialism. This openness to the other, the necessity to realize that the other really is other. That we can't just fucking stomp them over and like make them whatever we want. We have to have this exchange of, bringing the universalization about. So I think that's true. I would think that would be obvious if one read Hegel. Whether Hegel himself espouses this, I don't care, because I see it pretty strongly in his logic, even if he did not get that conclusion.
Yep. We're more Hegelian than Hegel.
Yeah, it's not hard to be that, quite frankly.
Yeah.
There's plenty of places where one can be that. So yeah.
Tons of things you can do that's better than the source of what you're reading. You can find out, draw conclusions. That's the utility of reading. It's not just to learn. It's to, like, think. Build upon the idea.
So yeah. It was a good article. Thanks, Josh, for recommending it.
Yeah, I liked it. This is good.
And we'll leave it here. See you later.
Goodbye.